Our meeting today for the PASE committee promoting a sustainable Easton. This meeting will be conducted via remote meeting and or hybrid approach. That means it can be conducted in part remotely via Zoom. Attendance by board or commission members will be remote. Remote attendance shall count toward quorum. The meeting may be broadcast live and or be recorded via ECAT as well. For those of you here and or for those of you tuning in from the town, there is a list of remote meeting procedures that can be found and happy to share if anybody has an issue regarding how to participate. We will be looking to take public commentary at the end of the session, so that way we can really maximize the engagement of the committee sharing a large volume of information tonight. So if you're from the public, please hold on. I think you'll learn with the rest of us a lot of information, and we'll be happy to entertain any questions via raised hands at the end. I do believe we have people that are remotely attending. So just for my own sake, before I take a roll call, could somebody just confirm whether or not there is remote attendance by, let's see, Andrea is here. Wendy will not be joining us. Jen Starr is on her way. Denise Higgins will not be here unless she joins remote. And if Denise does join remote, please elevate her. But we believe that she is most likely not going to be able to join. She said she was anxiously looking forward to seeing the reruns, though. So there's that for all of us. So with that, I'll take a roll call just to get us started. When I call out your name, you can say present. Dottie Filginetti.
Present.
Patrick Helen. Connor Reed.
Present.
Alicia Cabral. Andrea Starzewski. Did I even come close? Yeah, it was close. It was close for a Canadian-Irish guy in Easton. Kathy Millett. Marissa Souza.
Present.
Tom Broussard is present. James Hamilton.
Present.
Chris Mills.
Present.
Jocelyn Byers.
Present.
Nancy Donahue.
Present.
Excellent. So also remotely may be alternates who can listen in. Those alternates would be Chris Aker or Chris Cohn.
Here.
Chris Cohn's here. Is Chris Aker joining remotely by chance? Got it? Well, so Chris Cohn, you win the, is Chris okay?
Chris is fine.
Chris, perfect. You win the prize, meaning that there is an alternate at-large resident on purpose. One at-large resident is not here, so you have voting rights for tonight.
Oh, I'm reading.
Right? Next up is Amy Meehan or Sheila Dever-David, always for me known as Miss Dever-David, my kid's kindergarten teacher. Are either of them present? No. Okay, that's okay. Only when I say okay, obviously they can listen, but we did have both of our members, so they would not have voting anyways. Boy, housekeeping. This will get better. Okay. So I think we're ready to start tonight. Tonight for our agenda, if I can find it, I think I just X'd out of it. We have two main items. I'm obviously dragging because I need to call it up. Trying to fill the dead time. Where are you, Connor? There you are.
It is the structural revenue deficit report and then starting to get into expenditure comparative analysis on town departments.
Perfect. Thank you. Only two items that we have. In addition, as we talked about, we'll have a tremendous amount of community expenditure comparison reports. So we have a draft FY25 town staff comparison. Jen Starr is also present. Can you say present for us?
Present.
Love it. Welcome. The sounds like not a little. Last week, if you all remember, our agenda had about 19 to 20 items. There was a lot of information. I can assure you that these three items tonight will most likely yield a very similar amount of information. I wanted to share, I guess, some thoughts before we kicked off. First of all, this is our first session where we are literally going to get into departmental spend. I would ask everybody to be thoughtful about how they're engaging in terms of that information, because you'll find a large majority of our spend is people in any given department. And so I would just ask that the gravity of the situation with which we discuss either opportunities, risks, consideration for adjustment, be placed in that context as if those people were in this room and that you be that respectful as if somebody was being talked to as we talk about them. There's nothing wrong with what we're doing. It is healthy, it is active, but I just want to be thoughtful that there's a human element to what we are embarking upon. Whether it's, bless you, revenue or expense side, right? Because we know the solve could come from either one of those, and we're trying to build a foundation to understand which side, if either, should it come from. The next item, too, your mics are all live. So this is being recorded, and I assure you from many years in the select board and other times, they catch everything. So just be thoughtful for those of you that aren't accustomed to being live and on a mic, that any comments you make to the person next to you will absolutely be caught up. So just be thoughtful, not that we would ever do anything or say anything wrong, but in my luck, they would catch every third of my words, and that sentence would probably be horrific. So just a heads up on that as well. Today, Connor is going to do a lot of the work. It's a lot of work we actually participated together on in preparing for budget subcommittee meetings back in 2019 and 2020, right before COVID hit. So I'm incredibly familiar with it. Collectively, we play off each other well. So this will largely be the Connor. If it was Tom and Jerry, it would be, I would probably be the lesser of the two. So the Connor show with some support by Tom. But I did want to thank everybody last week because folks like Dottie, this is Patrick Helen, by the way, did not introduce himself last time. He is the chair of FinCom, has been for many years. He beat the over on that number of years as chair that anybody had on the pool. And Dr. Cabral, but a lot of folks have contributed information and knowledge about how the town operates. So ask questions. We are very familiar with it, having, I guess, appreciated this challenge was coming our way for many years. So we enjoy sharing that with you folks. So please ask questions. Quick shout out to Nancy for engaging over the last few weeks and preparing for tonight. Quick shout out for those people that got back to us with information, hugely helpful. It helps us understand where people's heads are at. And then in regards to that, most of my openings won't be this long, just for the record, but in regards to that, we need everybody's engagement. This is an active participation committee, meaning we don't have the bandwidth or time to carry folks that, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but like sometimes you can just show up and then get up to speed. The amount of information you're going to get, it would be like teaching me Algebra 2 again. Like I would just not have the base to get up to speed. So appreciate you doing the homework before we get here to read the materials and all that good stuff. Did I miss anything as I look at chairs, whether it's for school or select board or Connor or Dr. Brow?
No, not to extend your intro, but just this being the first meeting of PASE that's televised, just a 2-second recap of what it is we're actually trying to accomplish here between now and May.
Got it. That thing that you asked me to talk about before I actually got into my large and lengthy preamble. Yes. So for those in the community, and certainly for those that might not have been here at our last meeting, promoting a sustainable Easton stemmed from our last town meeting, whereby we appreciated the challenges that the budget presents in terms of there's a lot of worthy opportunities, things we'd like to invest in, items we'd like to see supported, but Easton, I think we'll talk about it today, but we have talked about it at town meetings, currently is in the midst of a structural revenue deficit. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing or wrong things were done. It means that we are largely, speaking generally, a bedroom community that draws its taxes from residents in the community. We do not have a large commercial base, and we are incredibly thoughtful and thrifty with every precious dollar we have that we expend. And so those dynamics are at play. The government, state government of Massachusetts limits us to a 2.5% increase in taxes each year. I think most of us can appreciate at a fundamental level, average cost of living increases usually are 3% if you're talking round numbers, depending upon where or when you are in an economic cycle. So over time, that half point, just using that example, aggregates to a meaningful difference between the expenses that are going out and the revenues that are coming in. Easton is not a community like those you may have heard in the recent news where we had to cut a majority or not a majority, but a meaningful amount of positions because they got to a budget cycle whereby they had to come to grips with their revenue challenges. We did not get there. So this is a proactive committee designed to not get there and to help educate the residents of Easton about the expenditures we have, the revenue streams we maintain, and what that looks like going forward.
Awesome.
Cheers. All right, thank you. So with that, again, we'll get briefer as we go forward. Why don't we kick it off? If you want to, we can dive right in, unless anybody has questions or comments. Perfect. Thank you all. Good to see everybody.
Thanks, Tom. So thank you all for being here. For those I haven't met yet, my name is Connor Reed. I'm a town administrator. I'm in my 8th year as a town administrator here. I'm in my 13th year working for the town. All of those years have been working for the select board. And so I want to just tie that to Tom's point about what this report, which doesn't have a super exciting title, but what this report tries to do is take a lot of institutional knowledge, not just from myself, but from other folks on the town side, the school side, who've been working together for many years, grappling with a set of primarily revenue challenges that we have been aware of for quite some time, that we have been able to successfully mitigate for quite some time, and that in my professional judgment, and I think the sentiment of some voters, if you look at town meeting, we're starting to reach kind of the end of the line on our options to continue to try to either innovate or duck and weave and get creative and outrun the kind of inertia of that longstanding revenue challenge. And so this report tries to do a few things. Hopefully folks at least flipped through it. And I'm trusting everyone did, so I'm not going to go through and read every single part because then you'll all quit the committee. But it tries to do 3 things. Put in one document what the principal causes, the precipitating factors are that led to Easton having a long-standing structural revenue deficit, and what are some of the most important consequences or challenges that come out of that. Create a document that we will update over time. One of the challenges we have, we put, if you've engaged with or read our budget book at this point, I hope you would agree, if there's a problem with the transparency of a budget, it is not that the information is not there, it's that there is so much information there that its accessibility becomes a challenge because it is hundreds of pages long, and that is hundreds of new pages of information every year. And so over time, we may dig into a lot of detail on the relationship between lottery tickets and unrestricted government aid in the fiscal 20 budget message, and then not talk about that again in 21 or 22. And then in 23, we're talking about minimum aid formulas. But that was spread out over a decade plus of documents. And so the goal here was to take the most important and relevant bits of all those town or school financial documents and pull those together and put it in one place. And the third and important part here is to try to keep this, although it's long, focused on that one subject, which is what is a structural revenue deficit? Why do we have one? And what does it actually mean for folks who live here, who work here, who raise families here, who work here? And so that's hopefully we succeeded in that. So just right out of the gate with some of the basics. What is a structural revenue deficit? Why do we have one? So basically that just means that our recurring revenue sources do not grow at a sufficient rate every year to keep up with recurring expense growth. That's the explanation in its simplest form. There's a whole lot of reasons for that we'll touch on, but basically that every year, I think when a lot of folks think about government spending, their frame of reference is the national government. A lot of people are surprised to learn that on the local level, you cannot deficit spend. That is not a thing. We do balance our budget every single year. And I think that can sometimes create a disconnect where folks say, you know, this guy in a suit has been getting in front of town meeting every year for 10 years saying we have a structural revenue gap, yet somehow the gap must get closed every year because we pass a balanced budget, and that's true. And we do it through a variety of different measures, but we have to balance our books every single year. The kind of devil in the details is how are we getting to that last stretch to get to a place where we have the revenue we need to hit our expenses for the coming year. So in Easton's case, there are many factors that influence having this revenue deficit, but it is principally attributable to meaningful cuts to state revenue to Easton in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. Following those cuts, it took 8 years, so between 2008 and 2016, there was 8 years of time where even in nominal dollars, not adjusting for inflation, our state revenue, which is the second largest source of revenue that we have for the schools, for all of our town departments, were coming in at lower receipts annually than they were in 2007. So it was not until 2016, 2017, again, not adjusting for inflation, not adjusting for the cost of providing services or purchasing goods, did that essential second category of revenue, which is state aid, grow enough from those cuts to get back to where we were a decade in the past. And so we have been dealing with that for nearly 20 years now.
And Connor, if I could, I'm assuming that's the graph at the bottom of page 7?
Yes. Well,
Got it.
It's 2. So thank you, Tom. That's a good pointer that someone in the committee gave me last time. I have a tendency to just start talking and then 2 hours go by. So please interrupt me, number 1. And number 2, if you get lost on the report, right? Most people have devices here, printouts. This is the structural revenue deficit report that's on the PASE page. Just interrupt me and say where are you. So right now,
can I share my screen to this if I wanted to?
there is an HDMI wire over there. I don't know if it will reach you. We can.
And the reason is maybe those people at home would want to see the graph to illustrate the point that you just made.
HDMI out.
I do.
Does that reach?
This is gonna be good.
You might need to swap seats.
Somebody's dying. Is that it?
Everybody take a deep breath.
So close.
There it is.
Not a glass. Do you mind if we switch seats, Dr. Gummer? Nothing against you at all, Mr. Helen.
Smell.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'll keep the coffee.
Awesome. There you go. That's very helpful. Thanks, Tom.
Yep.
So right now I'm still on page 5 to 6. But so that's the kind of overview. Our recurring revenue growth is not enough to keep up with recurring expense growth. We'll talk a bit about the expense side later, but on the revenue side, the principal contributor to that, one, as Tom mentioned, there's Prop 2.5, which most folks are familiar with. Property tax is our largest revenue source that is statutorily limited to grow by no more than 2.5% every year plus new growth. Even with new growth, you're still looking at maybe in the 3.5%. So then when your second largest source of revenue, which is state aid, is cut, or then grows at 1% or sub 1% rates for many consecutive years, the cumulative opportunity cost starts to tally into the multiple millions. Real quick, because we talked about this at the first meeting, 4 principal revenue sources in order of size for Easton: property tax, state aid, local receipts, that's things like building permit fees, license fees, ambulance receipts, meals taxes. So every time you go out, you are helping your town and school, so thank you for that. And other revenues and reserves.
So just to, I guess, drive a point home and to make sure everybody sees this, taxation number 1.7.
Sorry, you have your mouse over your inbox.
I don't even know where my mouse is. There you go. So the chart behind you, the bottom line, I think, here, is what Connor was just saying. In 2008, unrestricted government aid
That's right. So
plummeted.
So that's one of the revenue sources. And so state aid to Easton right now is about $14 million out of a $100 million general fund budget. And so it's, call it 14%. It used to be closer to 25% of our total revenue. And then the recession in 2008 started, and 2 things happened. One is that education aid, I believe, was cut, although I would defer to Dr. Cabral on that. There was ARA, which was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the recovery bill from the last global crisis we lived through 2 crises ago. That replaced some of that for a year, but then that was gone. And then unrestricted general government aid, which used to be known as lottery aid, so scratch tickets also do bring revenue to cities and towns. That was cut quite significantly by nearly 30% and renamed from lottery revenue to unrestricted general government aid. And even today, that second account, so UGA, the unrestricted aid, which is the second largest state aid category, even today is still at lower dollar amounts, not adjusting for inflation, than in 2008. So that has caused a major, major challenge for Easton. We receive fewer dollars in that account today than we did in 2008. The larger and ongoing challenge when it comes to state aid, Tom, if you can go back to page 6, is state education funding. And so state education funding, called Chapter 70, is a program that distributes revenue to cities and towns based on a variety of kind of formula bases from the state, also looking at things like enrollment. And in Easton, what has happened is that since 15 years ago, where Chapter 70 to Easton was roughly $10 million, that used to be 31%. If you looked at the school's operating budget at that time, Chapter 70 covered 31 cents of every dollar needed to run the Easton Public Schools. After the recession, and because of other factors, Easton has been, for I think this entire time now, nearly 20 years, what's called a minimum aid community. And so what that means is that no matter what, and now I can see my table of contents watermark on the screen and it's horrifying me, I'm very sorry about that, in the report. No matter what the bottom line increase to the Chapter 70 education funding program in Massachusetts is, and that's usually the bottom line that you hear about in the press, particularly post-COVID. Of historic amounts of funding for public schools. That is true on the bottom line sense for the entire state. But if you are a minimum aid district, like the Town of Easton, what that means is whether the Chapter 70 program is going up 2%, 5%, or 7%, you are not getting 2, 5, or 7. You are getting $30 per student of new revenue, which in Easton translates to roughly $100,000 of new state revenue per year, and that leads to what you see here in this graph, where the blue bars are Chapter 70 aid per year over time, as you can see, really, really, really slowly creeping up. We just passed 11 million this year in 2025, and we were just shy of 10 million 15 years ago. And so when you average that out, where you look at like less than 1% increase to that account every year. And again, that's irrespective of whether the state's revenue is up 5%, whether the Student Opportunity Act is putting 7+% increases out the door to some districts. When you're minimum aid, you are entitled to $30 per pupil, period. So what that means is that as the Easton Public School budget grows over time, just with keeping up with inflation, COLAs, the cost of doing business, the percentage of those costs that can be funded through Chapter 70 decline, and that's that bar you see. And so in 15 years, we've gone from a situation where 31 cents of every dollar to operate the Easton Public Schools was funded by Chapter 70 to now it's about 22 cents. And the remainder of that gap has to be filled with local revenues. And so that creates a huge pressure dynamic between Chapter 70 and unrestricted general government aid, which is still underwater from where it was, where you need to increasingly fill that gap with new local spending just to tread water, which leads to a very frustrating reality for taxpayers, for employees, where their taxes go up reliably every year. And they hear the town say somehow that isn't translating to a commensurate, let's say your tax bill is going up 2, 3, 4% a year. You're not seeing necessarily a 2, 3, or 4% purchasing power improvement in every single department. And that's because a tremendous amount of that increased local revenue right out of the gate has to go into filling the gap of either opportunity cost from sub-inflation growth to those state categories, or for many years actually filling net losses to those accounts. So before I go any further, am I making sense?
I have one question.
Sure.
What qualifies our district or our town as a minimum aid?
I'm going to defer to Dr. Cabral. on that one?
So there is a formula, and you can look it up on the DESE website. There's a 2-column formula for how they determine it's called the foundation formula. And what they do is there's a state-determined allocation for the cost of education for every child. Excuse me. And there are many different like 15 different categories. So a kindergarten student is one price. An elementary school student, a high school student is a different price. A vocational student is a different price. A student with special needs is a different price. And then there are like 7 or 8 low-income categories that are all different prices. They take a look at the data as reported in DESE, the information that we have in X2, and they extract that and tell us, based on where they categorize each child in the district, how much it's going to cost the district to educate students in a given year. They then give us a percentage of that, and the taxpayers are expected to close the difference. Easton does that, and so because of that, I'm really kind of watering this down, but I can provide more information, but it would take a lot longer.
No, that just helps. I just
They
didn't
close
know
the
if it was
gap
based
so
on-
they don't, so if they didn't close the gap, like an urban district where they don't close that gap, the state provides more funding. And how much funding depends on how much the town can afford. In essence, they are saying, we are not saying, they are saying that your town can afford to pay more. So we are a minimum aid district.
Thank you.
One other question about that. Am I not remembering this correctly? Was last year, were there funds from ARPA or from something that pushed our minimum aid up past $30 per student?
So that is half correct, yes. It wasn't from ARPA to my knowledge on the state level because they receive those federal funds too. But yes, going into 25, the state did increase minimum aid from $30 to $100 per pupil, which has been being lobbied and advocated for by the Superintendent's Association, the Town Managers Association, the Mass Municipal Association for over a decade. And it is appreciated because that's, that means instead of sub 1%, we got 3, which is good. We will work with that. That's a difference of a couple $100,000. It's some jobs that are saved. The challenge is that that was needed in 2010. And that was a budget decision. It's still statutorily set at 30.
Right, I was just gonna say that has never happened before in my history in education. It has gone to $60 one time. We don't even know if that's gonna stay. So to even reinvest that money is scary, but the deficit has compounded so much over time that is good. That would take so long to get us back
Right. And that's the
to
type of,
being out of a deficit.
and that's if we don't still have inflation and every other
Correct.
considerable cost increase per year.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right, and so, but I'm really glad you brought it up because that's important because we're in the context of, if you follow this, there is finally, I won't say a lot, but there is at least some attention on municipal and school finance in the Globe, WBUR, regional papers, much more so in the past 18 months or 2 years than there has probably been in the 20 years preceding. Some of that is because there have been strikes, but now it's starting to get into the details of, isn't it interesting that there's an inflation calculation baked into Chapter 70, but it maxes out at 4%. So when inflation is above that for multiple years, then what do you do, right?
I think
Can I ask a clarifying question? How frequently is the funding formula recalculated?
it's only been done once.
Okay, and so even like with more student enrollment at Easton Public Schools, they wouldn't recalculate the formula if our
Well,
numbers have changed?
I'm sorry, the formula stays the same. The formula for what it costs to educate students every year is done every year.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if this is where you were going, but something I've explained before is I've been trying for 12 years to get us into foundation formula, which would help us. That would mean not only would we be in the foundation formula, but we would also be eligible for things like SOA money. But it requires, for Easton, it requires something different for everyone. For Easton, I did a deep dive into all of the districts around and tried to figure out how are they getting more, how is this happening, and there were several factors. I talked about some of them last time, so stop me if I repeat myself. But one is the early college programs we have are not Chapter 74 programs yet. And so we need to work towards Chapter 74 certification, because that price tag I was talking about is a lot more for vocational education. We've been working toward that literally for 12 years, and like the last year and this year are the first years we actually got some programs going. Free kindergarten. That price tag is a student that pays any tuition at all. If they pay half the tuition and they are half free, which is what it was for a long time here, we only get half for each child. So we doubled that. That took 10 years to pass in the town. And then the third is enrollment. And part of building the new school was to get the enrollment going, but that clearly took a long time too. So these things have been worked on for quite a while to try to get us there. The problem is that now the target is moving. So as we're getting closer to get to foundation, the target now is moving again.
Right, and so correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things when we say going from half day fully covered to full day kindergarten being included, there's the state looks at that and doubles the price value to a community. But if you are like Easton at a place where your total school district spend is above what, so they double, they say you need twice as much money now for that kindergarten program. But if that puts the state's bar here and we're still here, you still only get minimum aid.
We have to keep closing that gap.
But as you increase the
Yes.
budget every year, even if it's incrementally 2-3%, it kind of
It's moving the target.
it keeps moving farther away as you get closer. So it's I commend Dr. Cabral and the schools for the work they've done to move towards there. And I think she hit it on the head with one of the things that's important to understand about this formula is that this isn't necessarily individual lawmakers looking at each district and saying they need money, they don't. It's a formula, no formulas are perfect, but the shorthand of it is that there are finite dollars on the state level to allocate towards public school districts. And based on economic factors, based on enrollment, based on other things, they look at a district like Easton, and the formula is functionally saying through its funding level that the state does not need to further subsidize Easton schools if we want them to be better, that the community would have to pay that. Right.
But what I thought you were originally asking was the foundation formula has only been set one time. It has never been revisited, the actual formula.
Yep.
And so we have been lobbying through our delegation at the state, but also through our professional organizations to have that formula studied, because it's pretty universally agreed that it is not equitable the way it is set up right now. It did move forward this year, but it was voted down. We're not going to give up, but it's one of those things that it takes a long time for it to happen, but it definitely needs to be recalculated and a new formula needs to be determined, but it was unfortunately voted down this year in the legislature.
How old is that formula? Do we know?
The student, No Child Left Behind.
Oh, okay, it's connected with that.
Yeah.
Thank you, thank you.
And I think an important thing here as well is part of the reason why this is now getting more coverage is that as demographic and economic trends shift in the state and as enrollment declines in most suburbs around Massachusetts, more districts are now sliding into becoming minimum aid.
Yes.
So
That's why
now,
we're getting more attention.
right,
When we were the few people screaming about it,
yeah.
we actually were able to get Senator Timilty and Representative Doherty both have brought bills on our behalf to the House and Senate respectively. Both have failed, and mostly because it really, other people, other legislators felt as though, well, it doesn't really affect my community. Now it's starting to affect more and more communities, and now it's starting to get more and more attention. Not enough, unfortunately, to get the formula studied, but we're still working.
So I think this year, close to 2/3 of districts have now become minimum aid. So this is going to be a enormous challenge, not just for Easton, but that's also part of why many neighboring communities have either gone through rounds of layoffs or had gone for overrides, and you will see those pressures continue to increase. And that is, I think it's really helpful as we do our work to keep kind of pulling the lens back and looking at the broader economy and looking at our industries, for lack of a better word, and other communities, to recognize that this is a trend moving through the state right now. That there's a lot of factors coming to a head that in Easton we may have been writing reports about for 15 years, but are now becoming more widespread, and those are going to be causing incredibly challenging budget decisions for communities around the state. So picking back up on Chapter 70, I think we covered a bit of it. If there's more questions, we're happy to answer them. But again, there's 4 or 5 different ways that this is explained in the memo. But I think one way that is really puts a point on it is that in the 15 years since we've been receiving these 1 or sub 1% increases, if you took the public school spending in 2010 compared to 2025, only 7.5% of that increased programming has been paid by Chapter 70. The rest has had to come from local funds. And I don't say that to say all the money is going to schools. That's not what I'm suggesting. But these are the mathematical realities of what these formulas mean on the local level. So moving on to page 7, unrestricted aid, smaller account, still really important. That is basically just general revenue that can be used for any governmental service. That is still below where it was in 2008. There was a handshake, agreement functionally between municipal governments and numerous gubernatorial administrations that whatever the state's revenue growth in a given year was, they did a revenue share, so they had a 3% year, then unrestricted aid went up 3%. You're still starting from a depressed baseline, right? Because it was cut 20, 30%. But it was still helpful to have that. There was some reliability. If the trend on the state level was 2 or 3%, you could count on 2 or 3%. When COVID hit, and after the initial economic drop, and things started really boosting on the state level, because unlike cities and towns, a lot of our taxes, the most significant of our taxes has its growth capped, right? Property tax. A lot of state tax revenues are percentages on values, income, sales tax. So as the price of goods started blowing up from inflation, that had a commensurate huge boost to state revenue in Massachusetts and in many countries, which again leads to this kind of challenging information dynamic where folks who have followed any of this have probably seen, although it has since cooled off, for many years there was headlines about record-setting governmental revenue, right? 10% increases year over year at the state level. Once the state revenue started growing like that, the revenue share stopped. And we were not benefactors of that. They began to look at revisions of, well, this growth is so above and beyond what our estimates are that we're going to do mid-year revisions to our forecast, and we'll give you an increase based on the updated forecast. And so that was another opportunity where we, on the local level, although we did get better increases, I think we might have gotten 5% in 1 year, did not have that opportunity shared down to our level. So moving into, there's another graph here, which is just if you actually adjust for inflation, it's an even more bleak picture where cities and towns have lost about 40% of their unrestricted general government aid value since 2001. And Dr. Cabral touched on this. One of the things that came up in the first meetings is part of our jobs, part of the elected leadership's jobs, is not to look to say, well, this is terrible, and I guess I'm going to go home now. We do lobby for the community. We lobby for our employees, we lobby for our residents, and we have made some progress. The challenge that we're dealing with is, it's great, we got a $100 minimum aid this year. It's commendable for the lawmakers who are involved in that, but it comes on the heels of 14 years where that was needed, and so we're still behind the 8 ball. Moving into what does this actually look like in Easton, going on page 8 and 9, and there's a lot going on some of these graphs. So Tom, I don't know if your screen share is still active. We might need to pull it back up again because I think your screen went to sleep. There we go. This is on our revenue side. So what this graph shows in blue in each fiscal year is how much local reserve money the town has tapped to close our revenue deficit each year. And what you see on the orange line on the opposite side axis is what that number means as a percent of our budget, right? Because using $1 million to close a revenue gap in 2006 is not the same thing as using $1 million to do it today, right? Because $1 million back then was a larger percent of your spend. That was more problematic. What you can see looking at this, and I try to put a kind of timeline here, and these are some of the real major kind of focusing points that have had impacts on our reserve spend. And just again, a recap, reserves for local budgets are free cash. That's money that is unspent at the end of a year out of any operating budget, which you do want. You don't want it to be too excessive, but you do not want to be running your margins. It would be no different than if you're planning your own household finances or a business. You do not want to be forecasting your expenses down to the penny, because then you have absolutely no room in the event of a forecast being off. So free cash is unspent expenditures at the end of the year or revenues that performed above your revenue forecast. Similarly, you want to be conservative in your revenue forecast. You can't. The State Department of Revenue will not let you kind of deliberately undercount or short your revenue forecast, so you could have huge free cash. So there's some standards there, but you want to be conservative on those so that you do have some cash being turned back at the end of the year. Free cash is, the analogy is it's like unspent money in your checking account at the end of the month. You've met all your obligations for a month, and maybe you take some of that, you move it into your savings account. Hopefully you take some of that, you purchase something you need for your house.
Can I ask one question about that? And I might be jumping ahead, but we've talked about this in the past. I've never really sat down and looked at the delta, but in looking at the comparison chart that you sent out for the, I can't remember what the term is, the comparing communities in the local,
Yes.
the neighboring communities, Canton and Walpole each have free cash from 2022 of $8 and $10 million respectively.
Yep.
Do you know why it's that much?
So I can't speak for those towns. What I can say is even in Easton, our free cash was unusually high that year in municipalities around the state, which was about double what we typically do. That is reflective of a lot of communities for fiscal 21 and 2 in the wake of the pandemic and major economic hits. I think it's hard for everyone to remember back then because there was this very unusual V-shaped recovery, right, where it plummeted really fast and then bounced. That hasn't happened before, and so a lot of places, including Easton, cut budgets really, really painfully. We cut 24 jobs going into fiscal 21 because we did not yet know what the recovery would look like and what state and federal recovery programs would look like.
Got it.
So it is pretty common that you'll see between fiscal 21 and 23 unusually large free cash certifications, because what happened is some of those programs, ESSER, ARPA, allowed communities to rehire folks that they laid off without dipping into their already depleted operating budget. So it kind of artificially improved your free cash generation for a small period of time.
Okay, thank you.
But we'll get there, because that's an important thing. That Easton has worked very, very hard, despite these revenue challenges, to grow our reserve balances substantially. But one of the things that's important is that even though we did that, we still have smaller reserves as a percentage of our expenditures than some of our peer communities, right? Because there are folks who, understandably, like going to town meetings is not always the most fun thing in the world. Going and doing it in other communities, I don't even know if you're allowed to. That would be pretty weird. But if you are in Easton and you see, hey, our stabilization fund has gone from 1 million and change to 7, things must be going well. Comparatively, yes, but it's important again to look at what does that represent as a percent of our spend, and what does that look like compared to the broader industry, and we'll come back to that. So looking at this graph, you will see there's functionally 2 years in the past 20 where there hasn't been local reserve use, and that was the last time an override passed, because this problem, and I'm not going to necessarily put Mr. Cohen on the spot, but I'm sure as a board member for many years, none of this all probably sounds very familiar, because a lot of these challenges exist in communities that do not have very large commercial tax bases and were warned as part of when Prop 2.5 was being created. And so in 2007 and 8, there was the last time an operating override in Easton passed. That unfortunately came 1 year before the financial crisis. And a lot of the revenue gains from that operating override, I believe it was about 3.4 million, were then cut out of other parts of the budget when the state budget was hit. And so you could see very rapidly in 09, 10, 11, the actual spend jumping up quickly, the percent of the budget being filled by reserves bouncing closer to 2.5% very quickly. And then for many years, it started to drop a little bit, and then 14, 15, 16, going up to kind of marker number 3, that was an attempt for an operating override again in the community for many of these same reasons. And that failed. And that year represented a high watermark of our actual reserve use, which was about 2 million, which represented 2.8% of our operating budget. Our stabilization balance was only 1.5 million, which is not good. And that matters for many reasons. Having a low stabilization balance isn't just a problem because you have less cash on hand when an economic downturn hits and you want to tap those for emergencies to keep people working or to pay for something that breaks. Ratings agencies, we have a credit rating just like people do. Ratings agencies, when we are doing things like building Blanche Ames or building police or fire stations and bonding millions of dollars, rating agencies look at your books, not just your operating performance, so they look at your reserves. And that's a really important factor in what your rating, your credit rating or your bond rating is, which directly translates into the interest you pay. The higher interest you're paying, that's money that's leaving the town's general fund that could otherwise be going towards programs or positions. And so it's really important to keep a healthy reserve balance. So 2016, that override failed. The town adopted a series of relatively stringent financial guidelines in the wake of that. We started to deliberately curtail the amount of reserve money that we were using in the budget. You could see it start to drop over time when you get to number 4, fiscal 20, which was actually the last year before COVID. We had reduced our one-time reserves in the budget. We had cut that in half in 4 years from 2 million to 1 million. We dropped it to the lowest percent of our budget since the override. And that wasn't done easily. We had some very austere budgets. We had some programs that were being lost through attrition and positions that were slowly being lost through attrition. We had some really hard town meetings that many of us were here for. But we, and I'll ask Dottie to weigh in, but we looked at that as the voters by a close to 2-to-1 margin rejected that override, and this is our choice. How I feel about the programmatic need is one factor, but that override was rejected, and we had to pass very, very austere budgets, and that started to weaken our operating position in order to strengthen our fiscal one. I don't know if you want to, if I'm getting that history right, but.
No, you're absolutely right, and that's when the board put some fiscal policies in place to make that happen, and there were some really hard decisions on budgets to not fund certain things. Also, we continuously look for ways to find efficiencies, but that generates like a year or two's worth of relief. And then you just have to keep finding new ways. There's only so many new ways to save. I think we're ahead of the curve on most of them, on the town and the school side, but it's just not, that's why it's a structural revenue deficit, because there's just not a way to fix it that way.
So we were moving in the right direction on that, kind of closing that revenue gap, not without some operating pain, and then COVID hit. And we bounced around a bit on what those total reserve spends were because there was federal funds to be used. And what's important to recognize here is that when fiscal 21 happened, we eliminated more than 24 jobs. And so it's not as if, as we've gone through this, our response has been, oh, well, I guess there's just nothing we can do. We didn't do that because it was programmatically appropriate. We didn't do that because it was right for those departments or for students or residents, but because we had no choice. And even with doing that, it took a while for some of those revenues to recover. We were kind of closer to where we were in the mid-2010s. And then really where this has started to hit a major pressure point again is fiscal 25, which is where we are now. I think folks are relatively familiar with the factors there, but there are many, right? We have 20% cumulative inflation when we still have Prop 2.5. There's no inflation adjustment factor on that. We have finally begun to make some progress on maybe getting $100 minimum aid, but it came at the expense of 13 or 14 years of waiting. And at the same time, there are also federal grants that are expiring around the country, pretty much all at the same time, that could have been relief valves, although obviously temporary, which everyone is aware of. And it put us in a position where with our budgets, as certain costs with utilities, with transportation growing at a really high rate, we had operating budgets coming in closer to 4 or 5.5%, which we structurally cannot sustain. And so we went through a difficult budget cycle this year, and the kind of collective choice was that we had built our reserves up for years and years and years, repeatedly saying when the federal funds run out, when inflation starts to accumulate, this is going to get really hard. And so this budget is using more reserves than we ought to be using. And it is a temporary patch to get, it gives us, and I said this in the budget message, I think I said at town meeting, it buys us 1, maybe 2 years, maybe 2, to decide how and whether we want to deal with this structurally. So I don't, and if you folks read this, you know there's other aspects on this and what have we done.
Connor,
to
before
try
you
and
move on,
mitigate this. Yeah.
just if I could I just get the graph to go back up real quick? I don't know if you guys did that. I didn't do it. Okay, so I guess team, trying to make connections of what we want to accomplish today. If we do this right, Connor, I, all of us, we help you navigate what revenues we have available to us. We're telling you with this slide, we're using our savings account, basically, just speaking plainly, and that we're using it at a rate that we have not used it in 20 years. As you think about the revenue, I want you to ask yourself, which one can I go get more from? Because our solution will either come from getting more revenue or spending less. We're going to get to the spend in a little bit. But this part is designed for revenue. So I need you to make sure, ask your questions and understand it. So for example, we're going to talk about new growth, I think, in a minute. We'll talk about new growth. And I think there, it's not how do you go get it tomorrow, because those things aren't tomorrow. But I think Connor will do an artful job at illustrating how over the last decade, there have been examples of us being appropriately engaged on building new growth. Sewer districts being a good, easy example, right? So that's one. But state aid, I can tell you, and I think we all heard Dr. Cabral say how many people went up those steps at the State House to talk, educate, help, cajole, and try to get us more of our share. But state aid is not a tomorrow thing. Chapter 70, not a tomorrow thing type thing. So just think about the buckets of materiality. The number one is 72%, using round numbers, is taxation. 14% is state aid. Taxation is fixed, it's 2.5%. You get new growth, and I ask you to independently assess, are we as leaders and stewards doing a good job on new growth? I would argue, good. There's always room for improvement, but there are definitely communities that are more challenged than we are, especially with the values that reflect Easton residents, right? So that's why I just want to raise, as we go through this revenue, understand and ask yourself which ones can I do anything about and when? Because if the answer is at the end of the day, hypothetically, I can't do anything about any of those, then honestly, this is a simple two-sided coin. You're going to have a lot of engagement on the expenses. I can tell you now, I'll just plant the seed, the expense side is probably not the coin the side of the coin you want to go to when you compare yourself against your communities, against the state, against like-sized communities around. You pick whatever combo you want, pretty much. And Easton is incredibly thrifty and makes a dollar go pretty far. But that will be, again, for you to digest afterwards. And that's kind of why we're here. Because the one side of the coin of revenue is not easy and we're using our savings. We're not using our savings because we're not being responsible, as you'll see on the expense side. Then you're going to get to the expense side and you're going to say, wow, this is pretty, do I care about public safety? I think I do. Everybody feels like we do. I can tell you all the times I stand before the residents of the community, they do, with their votes, so to speak. So schools, absolutely people care about that. And when you look at the rest of the community expenditure report, you'll see we compare incredibly well on average. And in several spots, we spend the least per person and the least amount of dollars on things like town government. Not by a little, but like a lot. So I just wanted to pause there to kind of make this real, that we're using our savings account, that we've already walked you through 72% of your monies come from taxation, 14% come from the state. That's 86% of the revenue that you can impact that you can't tomorrow. New growth is another piece. Can't do that tomorrow, so to speak. So hopefully that just makes it real a little bit. I know we go through a lot of numbers. We talk about a lot of different things and programs and all that good stuff. Does that make sense? Does anybody have questions up to now? Go for it.
I have a question about the revenue side that might be jumping the gun a little bit, but it's related to grants and the grant cycle.
Yes.
We learned that Chapter 70 funds are not going to be resolved by next year. Is the grant cycle a similar thing, that you're working so far ahead that when would we start to go for these grants? I'm sure it probably varies versus the different opportunities, but.
Sure, that's a
Good
good question.
question.
And I will speak to the town side. I'll ask Dr. Cabral to weigh in on some federal grants and things of that nature as it impacts the schools. Right out of the gate, one of the things that's really important to keep in mind with grants is grants are one-time money. Even if it's a recurring program, usually there's a sunset or usually there's qualifying factors. It's not entitlement spending, right? That's a word folks don't, I think, use in the lexicon anymore, but it's not guaranteed revenue. And so all other things being equal, you do not want to be carrying programs, because programs are people, in grants. That aside, where we are with grants is the grant cycle is different for almost every program. They generally, on the town side, follow a fiscal year basis, but when they open, when they review, when they award, can vary. On the municipal side, the grant incentive structure from the state is very heavily towards capital. It's towards infrastructure and not towards positions. The key kind of looming grant over our discussion is ARPA, which is the American Rescue Plan Act, and ESSER, which is Elementary and Secondary School Economic Recovery. Is that right? Yeah. Oh, cool. I got it.
Nice job.
So those were critical, essential pieces of legislation passed at the national level in March of 2021, when we were in the absolute worst of the pandemic, that distributed $350 billion to schools, cities, and towns around the country, and that, in my judgment, probably prevented the layoff of thousands of police, firefighters, and teachers around the United States. And it happened, I think, mostly out of public view, but that has been really important. And in Easton, ARPA was nearly $7 million that had to be spread out over multiple years. Part of that was programmatically for what was called revenue replacement, where the United States correctly said, hey, we've been through this before 12 years ago, and there's going to be a hit to the public sector. A lot of focus when there's kind of macroeconomic discussions or news discussions is on the broader economy, private sector job growth. There was a huge hit, anyone who worked through it knows, to public sector employment in the wake of the 2008 recession, and that recovery was very slow, and the folks involved in running ARPA felt that it was perhaps that stimulus didn't go far enough. And so that was a large amount of stimulus that was available through grants to cities, towns, and schools. Those expire in December. Mm-hmm. And so those grants were more permissive than many. As I said, one of them was programmatically for revenue replacement, where the federal government said cities and towns are probably going to have hits to certain tax revenues. We will allow you to use a certain amount, which was a good thing. That's what I was speaking about with Patrick. That allowed a lot of places where you see, wow, that free cash is unusually high. It allowed us to rely on functionally Federal Reserve dollars to bridge those gaps rather than immediately leaning into local reserves. And it bought us a few years, which is great. But it's one-time money. So as far as on the town side, yes, we're kind of continuously going for those grants. I itemized only kind of the largest ones here on page 11 and 12 of this report, but we, of course, working with the schools, have been very aggressive in pursuing grants. We've been very successful. We brought more than 60 million in state and federal dollars to Easton, largely around buildings and infrastructure, because that is, if you're a grant issuing authority, that's kind of what you want to do. You don't want to give somebody a grant to hire someone and have to lay them off. But ARPA and ESSER were different in that regard. And I think now there are some of the news media or the coverage of the challenges schools or towns are facing in 2024 with COVID in the rearview mirror are saying, well, gee, why didn't anyone use a grant for a position? That was a silly thing to do. Sure, in a vacuum, that is true. At the time that money came out, and it was designed for things like interventionists, you know, the country was in free fall, and it was an emergency. And so a lot of the programs that those things funded, and I'll ask Dr. Cabral to talk about them a little bit, I think were expected to be 1 or 2 year challenges. Perhaps if the schools have help with interventionists for a year or two, then the learning loss will be fixed. And that's not, and I'm not saying that's a ridicule of the federal government. No one alive has ever gone through something like this. And so I appreciate you bringing that up because it's an opportunity to point to, and it's not an excuse for anything, but it's a reality of, there was a pandemic that happened in the middle of all of this too, right? And so some of those grants were for positions to assist with pandemic-related things like learning loss that, I'll defer to all the educators in the room, were not in fact things you could fix necessarily by bringing folks on for a year or two. So turn it over to you to pick up that easy conversation.
Sure. So yes, the funding was critical to keep schools open. Certainly in the beginning for personal protective equipment, for air purifiers, to replace RT units, to the air units on the top of the buildings. None of that would have been done without that funding. But then with any grant, every grant I've ever written, it is for very specific purposes, for a very specific set time. You have to itemize your spending of it when you apply for it, and then you have to stick to that, or you have to make amendments, and it has to be articulated very clearly why you would change anything. So you can't really make a lot of mid-course adjustments. Grants are very, very hard to find for people for the reasons Connor just stated, especially for self-insured municipalities where you would be paying one, because you're paying the unemployment, but two, because for educators anyway, anyone that is in the Massachusetts Teachers Retirement System, when you put their salary in a grant, you also have to put their MTRS contribution in the grant. So it takes up a large amount of money. For $100,000, you can't hire two $50,000 people because you have to put in 11% of their. Excuse me. Most grants don't allow people. As Connor stated, the federal grants that came in as the result of the pandemic were intended for learning loss. Now, right before COVID hit, we had a very small pilot program at the Richardson Olmsted School only of interventionists. That's where it started. We had it at that school particularly because grades 3 and 4 are when students transition from learning to read to reading to learn, and it is very important they don't fall behind at that stage in order to really access the academic language they're going to encounter in the upper grades. And so we were backfilling skills. It was so successful that fortunately, when the pandemic did hit, we knew that that was a replicable model to use in the other schools. And we literally had interventionists everywhere. Again, that is, the grant was only for learning loss during the pandemic. That's very specific. Interventionist is perfect for that because that's specifically what we were using them for, learning loss during the pandemic. As, again, I apologize, I stated this at our last meeting, the consensus amongst most experts at the time who had never lived through something like this was that, well, things were shut down for about 18 months. in about 18 months, everybody should be back up and ready to go.
Fine.
The educators on this half of the room know very clearly that that is not what happened, not just academically, but socially, emotionally. The isolation, the loss that students faced, particularly in, I certainly would never minimize the impact of the pandemic across the globe, but in a district like Easton, where our students, the majority of our students, have not faced some of the challenges that were faced during COVID, that in other more diverse districts, they tend to have that more frequently. And so we didn't have the resources to handle the level of need. Even our general ed teachers and administration did not have the level of expertise, tools in the toolbox to be able to mitigate some of those concerns. So in that time, we've added nurses, we've added school adjustment counselors, not with grants, but we added interventionists strictly from the grant because we needed the operating budget for those other roles that we knew were not going to be short-term needs. Now we're at the end of that and we're realizing it's very successful and we're closing gaps, but the grant is ending. We have to encumber all the funds by December. And so now we're at risk of the things that were put in place with the grant, which were very purposefully things that we hadn't had before, so that we knew when the grant ended we could potentially live without, but they're still very needed. For example, the ESY program, not the ESY, excuse me, the SEA program, the Summer Enrichment Academy, which has been way more successful than we even anticipated. That's fully funded through these grants. The interventionists, our early college subsidies for students, our security, a lot of security improvements that needed to be made, air improvements that are made in buildings. That is all going to end. So that is about, I mean, we're just at the school department, we're looking at a $2 to $2.5 million deficit once everything ends, of things that now people really want to continue and our students really need to continue. And so they just were not offered long enough. And so that is what we're facing next year, is starting next year in order to maintain what we have right now, just to maintain it, not expand, not get into proactive part of our budget, not put in new programs. We're going to start next year at least $2 million behind.
I would say from just a lay person's approach, and I don't know if there are stats, I've looked for them previously, to illustrate that we actually over-index on grants in Easton relative on average to others. I think you folks can nod intuitively. I can't find it statistically, but I know when we go and get grants for the roadways, Dave Field is great at doing that. I know we leverage the SAFER grant at times for the personnel in the fire department, which the SAFER grant is basically leveraging grants to fund portions of pay for X number of years, whether I think year 1 is in full.
Yes.
And then by the end of year 3, we have to pay for it. But
Phases.
we knew we needed people and we knew there was a grant. And so we bought ourselves a couple year of payments for a couple of people. But then that bill comes due. So I think there's a theme of being creative or thoughtful or opportunistic, but eventually, that's just the ball's rolling faster. But we do over-index on grants, which is a good thing. That's money anybody can apply for, and we work hard to go get more than our fair share of the same pie. So
I do pose my question exactly in that regard because I'm very, very impressed with the amount of grants in here, and I agree. I think constantly school and town have really secured some amazing grants, and so I'm just wondering if in this position that we're in, are there other grants that, knowing that they can't fund a person or people in a program, but are there ways that they can help us bridge this gap that we should, and I do feel that we're going for everything that we can and just should continue to do so.
good question.
A dedicated grant writer.
Yes, and we don't have a grant writer. Thank you, Patrick. I think Jim had a...
I was actually going to ask that, something similar. I guess there's a couple questions. I'm sorry, they're all kind of in a row. Do we have any stats on applied for grants versus grants won? are there consultant services, I guess, that you almost pay like a headhunter fee? They go win the grant and you pay them a percentage of money for, like, I don't even know if that exists, but is there an incentive to find a way to maximize the amount of grants we're applying for, or
Sure.
improve winning odds in some
Sure.
way?
So there's certainly an incentive, which is that it helps us capitalize programs we need to do, particularly with infrastructure. We track the grants we win in our office. I don't know if we keep a list of all the ones that we apply for, but I will check. That's a good question. There are some consultants who will assist with applying for grants, but I'm not, so a good example is they're often part of the state, right? Because there's ethical concerns you want to be careful about too, right? You don't want a situation where there is a grant that's going to take money from the state, distribute it to a municipality, and there's a consultant who could theoretically stand to be the recipient of that grant, come in and say, I'm going to help you win that grant. Because then that could lead to a kind of cookie cutter, here you go, I'll help you get this, and then it doesn't end up being the product your community needs. But I'm not sure about the headhunting piece. There are stats, at least of a regional and federal transportation funds that I will try to get. I'll take a note, DPW. So there's something called the Old Colony Planning Council. It's a regional planning entity, and so they have a certain amount of municipalities within them. They have a certain amount of road miles that are state numbered or owned, and there are members and delegations sent by each community to them that have to lobby for, and I'll look to Dottie because she has worked in this space, limited federal transportation funds. So a few examples, Depot Street, that was funded, the construction was entirely funded by state and federal road dollars. We'll be signalizing Washington and Elm Street this coming year, state and federally funded. And the way that you maximize your odds of winning are that they give preferential grant status to communities who fund their design locally. And so we've prioritized bringing some engineering staff in-house rather than paying at the consultant rate. So we employ engineers in public works to design these roadway projects out of their available budgets so that they're more competitively situated to go to these regional bodies and win often a 10-to-1 return, right? So Depot Street, our local design costs and land takings were about $1 million, and then the state and federal dollars were 10 to 12 million to do that whole project, including moving the monument. Those are 10-year processes, but so that's an example of a kind of way that we try to make sure that we're positioning ourselves to win the maximum amount of grants. Another area where is important is the state, particularly under the current administration, is pretty good about communicating to cities and towns, these are the things we want you to do to win these grants, right? Much like tax credits on the federal level are meant in theory to incentivize certain behavior, right? We have a mortgage tax credit that's meant to incentivize buying houses. Grants on the state level are meant as policy tools for states using voluntary finances to get communities to do the things that meet the administration's agenda. And so right now, Easton is positioned extremely well. And I think the last year we went through, they also created a clearinghouse called One Stop for Growth. So you can basically go in and apply for, the state has a centralized clearinghouse of here's all the different grants that you as a municipality may be able to win. Here's the qualifying standards, and here's what we want to see that you're doing. And Easton works to make sure that we are doing all of those things. A lot of those are policy-based. One of the things that's really important is that the state wants to see that you are not hostile to housing. That is essential. A lot of our infrastructure, we have received millions through the MassWorks program. A major indicator on whether or not you have standing to receive that grant is whether you are a housing choice community, which is one that is coming into compliance with 40B, which is making sure that you are having affordable housing developed in your community and that you're not putting up unnecessary roadblocks to the development of affordable housing. They want to see that you're a community compact community. It's actually framed on the wall over there, where it is a practice, it's a best management practices program at the state level where, and I believe it started under the Baker administration, they correctly said it is a little silly that we have 351 cities and towns that have 351 ways to run a police department or a town manager's office. There's got to be some overlap in best practices. And so you enter into a management agreement basically with the state where they look at your practices, whether it's how you structure your financial operations, what type of use of force policies you have in the police department. And if you voluntarily go through that quasi peer review process and improve your standards, that counts as kind of +1s on your grant application. So Easton does those things. And so what that does is when our application crosses their desk, they know that we are thoughtfully incorporating long-term strategic planning into why we're asking for money. As much fun as it is to get grants, say, hey, we got this money, we can point to and say we have a 5-year capital improvement program. And this is where this fits. There's all sorts of other factors with the MSBA as far as what your enrollment trends look like. But I think, and Dottie works in this space, so I guess did I miss any aspect of that?
No, the only thing I'd want to point out is it's really great to get these grants, but the other part of it is we also have to administer them, and we don't have extra people to do that. That's where really a lot of the work is. And so when we have department heads that are writing the grants and administering them, I think Easton does a really good job at being selective about what grants are we going to get. We don't take the lower, if there's a lot of thought that goes into it. What do we want to have as an outcome of getting this money? How is it going to drive economic development, to attract businesses, to produce new growth?
And you have to meet those benchmarks. You have to report that out
Right.
as the grant is going on, and you have to meet the benchmarks that were imposed.
And they know, what towns are doing the right thing, which towns aren't, according to, when I say the right thing, meaning following what the administration is looking for. They are not funding communities that are against the MBTA communities. That there's only 2 right now that are in non-compliance, but by December, there's a number of communities. Easton is in the interim compliance, and I know that all the grants that are happening right now, they are looking at things like that, and they will claw back the money if the communities that haven't voted yet got a grant award. There's some grant awards that'll be announced in the next couple of weeks. If a community gets it, there's going to be a disclaimer that they'll have to give the money back if they're not in compliance.
Right.
Do other towns, is there some sort of formal grant office or management office in other towns? Like, is that something worth exploring even beyond fiscal 25?
Sometimes in big cities they have grant writers, but it's not very typical. Most of the towns are smaller than Easton.
Yeah.
They don't even have department heads that we have, like planners and things like that. So a lot of times the community will have to hire consultants. Honestly, Easton really does get most of the grants. I can't really think of maybe a couple of grants that we didn't get that were smaller grants, but
We'll get a partial award because we ask for lots of money. But I think that's a good question. And then the next one maybe is, well, what about regional opportunities?
Yeah.
And so there are, so those same regional planning entities that administer certain grant programs also offer technical assistance for grant writing, particularly when it comes to doing something like trying to go for like a federal Environmental Protection Agency grant, something that's a really heavy lift. We do have relationships with regional planning entities that can assist with those things. But it has never been, with the margins we have, and as we talk into the detail of the things we're not funding as far as staff levels for, in schools or DPW or police or fire, it's one of those things that it makes a lot of sense and it would be great, but it's just never been close to making the cut to have a grant writer on staff.
We actually, sorry.
That originally Martha White was hired to do grants, but she ended up taking your position. Well, town manager, what you are now.
Sure.
Eventually.
Yes.
So it started off with the idea, but didn't last.
Right, and I can't speak for prior administrations, but I can use my own career trajectory as a similar example where my first job in Easton was to sit in the lobby fresh out of college and know enough about every department to know where people need to go to open a business. And that was a really valuable position. I'm not saying it because I did it. But
I was great at it.
I didn't say I was great. I said the position was good. I was okay. But as my career moved, we did not backfill that and fund it because of just the constraints in other places, and that is an opportunity cost for the town to not have that.
I think it just puts a base to your saying that just can't have them. There's no place for them.
Right. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Just a time check, so 6:51. Would love to get through, if we can, the structural revenue deficit document,
Yes.
which we're close.
Yeah.
I would then recommend maybe a 5 or 10 minute break if we can do that in a hybrid world. Zoom, we can do that,
Yes,
right?
just mutual remote.
And Then we'll just catch our breath, and then we'll launch into the community expenditure comparison. Does that work from a timetable? Sound good?
I'm fine with that. Sounds good.
Awesome.
So I will be faster on this part of it. So the second section of this report is basically, okay, that's a whole host of problems. What have we done about it besides kind of gripe? And I think we've done quite well, and perhaps to our detriment, where it has turned into a bit of crying wolf that we have been saying. At the end of this report is quotes from multiple town administrators' budget messages going back a decade saying this day is going to come, and we have an interest. We want to avoid that because we don't want to get there, and so we have kind of evaded the inevitable outcome of having that structural revenue gap by winning grants to incentivize new growth, by reorganizing departments or regionalizing services altogether to cut our costs, by going into the GIC and doing healthcare reform to save money in that year and slow the growth trajectory of healthcare, which is one of our largest fixed costs, although that was one of the major pain points in our fiscal 25 budget because GIC went up nearly 10%. Energy generation, we have expanded. We have a lot of solar, whether through power purchase agreements and net metering on landfills or on school roofs that have saved a significant amount of money. Like a family, the town has to pay utility bills, and running the utilities for I think close to perhaps 800,000 square feet of buildings costs a lot of money every year. And so we've been able to save a lot of money through expanding solar. We have built our reserve balances to hedge against that deficit. We have negotiated, you could pick your word, but sustainable, conservative, collective bargaining agreements with our labor unions as much as we can, right? Because there is a competing pressure there. And it's, I think, one that you're seeing in the press to an extent in some communities, but it is the job of organized labor to advocate for their members and try to get a good and a competitive and a fair wage package. And those folks, as all of us are impacted by inflation and those pressures. On the flip side, we still have to create a balanced budget. And all but I think 30 positions across the town and school government are, maybe not 30, maybe 40 or so, are unionized. And so that creates a huge pressure dynamic where you want to offer competitive and fair wages because it is in the public interest to do so. You do not want folks to start leaving for better opportunities elsewhere because then your programs and the quality of education, the quality of services take a hit. But you also do need to, at the end of the day, be able to balance a budget where your property tax is 2.5% plus growth and your state aid is 1%. The reality of the structural revenue deficit, even though there has not been an operating override since before the 2008 financial crisis, is that Easton does what's called levying to the max, which is because of those other revenue factors, it is almost automatic that the budget, it is discretionary for a community. You don't have to do the 2.5%. But if we didn't, we would be doing functionally millions of dollars in operating cuts every year. And so although the 2.5% plus new growth isn't a 10% tax bill increase for folks in a given year, it compounds pretty fast. And so taxes are not cheap. And that is part of what I allude to, a frustrating reality for people who see the coverage of historic amounts of revenue on the state level. There's all this money for these programs that for basically wonky formula reasons Easton may not qualify for. Their taxes go up and we have to work extraordinarily hard just to kind of tread water. So we have also made sure to try to increase programs that provide direct financial assistance to members of our community, particularly older residents, individuals with disabilities, veterans, and their families. So super quick, just touched on it before. In 5 years, we've brought more than $60 million in competitive state and federal infrastructure and facilities grants to Easton. Why does this matter for our operating position? Because one of the things that's important for our operating position is that we continue to be an attractive and vibrant community where people, economics exists, right? The value of our properties, which is what our taxes are based on, is directly tied to people's perceived value of the community and how much they want to move here. And so when they see the Blanche Ames School getting built, they say, wow, that is a great place. That's a community investing in itself, and I want to be there. When we are building sewer systems, we had no public sewer up until 2014. That substantially constrains any kind of commercial activity. It is hard to even have a restaurant in many cases, depending on the size of it, if you are on a Title V septic. And so in 10 years, we built 3 sewer districts. That has led to a lot of redevelopment. A lot of that has been housing, and that's because markets exist and economics exist. And as time has passed, that is where the pressure and the opportunity for developers is. There's a ton of demand for housing throughout the state, throughout the Northeast. There's not a lot of developable land. And so that's why you see a lot of proposals, not just in Easton, but around the state, to use the available land, particularly that has infrastructure for housing.
A lot of times they call it highest and best use of economic value of whatever asset you're buying. If you're buying land on average and you can put a 7-figure house on it, you can have a good return if you're a builder. And if you can buy a large plot of land and do lots of houses at that rate, you can make a lot of money. And in a community like Easton, to Connor's point, that's highly desirable with all the amenities, great services that we provide, in school and town services. That makes a lot of sense for people to come in. We are a residential-based community. It fits the mold, so to speak. Connor, go ahead.
So then there's some other areas. We've done a lot of roadway improvement projects, largely funded with grants. We have built a lot of water treatment plants, and we've also moved from running 911 dispatch out of a very small room, kind of tacked onto the police station, to a regional center that covers Mansfield, Foxborough, Norton, I'm forgetting, and us.
Easton.
Sorry. And that was funded entirely through a grant as well. And you can see, although it's not as easy to say, okay, therefore these are causally related, but there's the new growth chart here, which is on page 12. I don't know, Tom, if you want to pull it up. But
I do.
In the wake of the 2008 recession, prior to us constructing sewer infrastructure in places where you could incentivize some growth,
I think it's you tapping it.
there you go.
It's not me. I think it's...
Well,
No, not you. No,
think
nobody's in trouble.
I think it's both. It's everyone. You can see the rolling 5-year averages, that dotted orange line. Obviously, one of the contributory factors of that dropping is not a policy-based thing locally. It's because we had the recession. But you will see that kind of 10-year window, it really started to increase from about 400 or 500,000 a year to hitting 1 million a year. And this is why that matters. When folks will kind of quickly say, as I have 7 times tonight, your tax revenue is limited to 2.5% plus new growth. And I think a lot of folks are probably think, what does that mean? I don't want to ask. So you have your total tax revenue. It can go up 2.5% next year, plus any new taxable property. So when there's new construction, that adds above that 2.5% limit, and then that becomes the floor next year. So you then get 2.5% on that, and it increases the rate of growth, and it spreads out the taxpayers paying for it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So new growth is super, super important, particularly in a minimum aid community that does not have state aid increases. So our new growth increased relatively healthily leading up to COVID. It dropped after that. We're hoping to start seeing that pick up again because there is a bit of a lag in your new growth compared to, if you go to the next page, you'll see our building permits have been growing quite extraordinarily. We are hoping to start seeing that translating into higher new growth once again.
So can I make 2 points? Back to the new growth. When did we have the largest single taxpayer, which I believe is Avalon, come online?
2018.
So in 2018, we had about $1 million worth of new growth. And the part that I want to illustrate, that was tied to the sewer district, in part, important aspect of the project, for that Mansfield corridor. That project started in, I think, 2014, you said? But the planning for it started roughly, and I went back in 2004 if I found the first time we referenced it. So the part that I want you to solve and ask yourself again, because every side in the revenue could be an answer to your coin. Well, hey, why don't we just do new growth? Great. You want to do something that gets you $1 million project? Do something that takes 10 years to plan, another 4 years to execute, get everybody in the community aligned. Go find somebody as big as an Avalon, put them in, and you'll get a one-time bump of $1 million. So that cycle was a 15-year cycle if you drew the dotted lines to where Avalon finally said, yeah, I can come in there. You got a plaza in front, great target amenities. I'll come in, housing, great, good community. People will definitely come in. you're on sewer, great. I don't have to worry about septic because I don't want to put that in. That's a huge cost to me, and it's a risk. Nobody wants to maintain that, and it's a big expense 20 years from now.
Well, actually, if I could jump in there.
Please.
That was part of how we delivered the 5-quarter sewer at a lower cost and ahead of schedule, because it was in our long-term comprehensive wastewater management plan, which is as exciting as it sounds, to sewer that part of town. Avalon wanted to build, and if they were to build their own wastewater solution on site, it would have been roughly $4 million. And so instead, we said, give us $4 million and we will build the sewer faster, and we did.
Well said.
And so that reduced the cost of that to that district as well, which is how we were able to do that project in part, which was the largest and most complicated infrastructure project the town has done, and deliver it, although it is not cheap from a betterment perspective. I know there are folks in, Dale is always watching. We were able to cut the cost of that infrastructure to those homeowners substantially and have those come in at lower cost than every other sewer that we had built.
Great call.
Part of the reason for that is because we brought state leaders down to show them, here's what we did with the money you gave us before. And we showed them all the housing that we've done, all the infrastructures, the new businesses, the new restaurants. We had the restaurants come and talk to them, that they wouldn't have been able to grow their business if it wasn't for us providing all that infrastructure. And then we got the grant that year for the sewer, because they want to see not just that you're doing well with that particular thing, but how are you planning to interact with all these other parts of your community? How did that impact your schools? That's part of why the MSBA really thought that that was a great project, is because we are a community that values families, that values students. We're doing the right thing with all these things. We're making the investments. And so they look at everything holistically for the whole town and everything that we're doing. And that, bringing them down to actually see that, I've heard a lot of stories afterwards that was really impressive to them.
Yeah. So as you're thinking, just one last point, if I could. Yep. As you're thinking about at the end of this effort, the equation, am I gonna get more revenue or am I gonna spend less? One of the things is I could go get new growth. And how much you would ascribe to that is probably not as much as you thought it might be if you didn't have this slide. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Like, even you can't just say go get better next year. Like, that's planning, that's hoping. We don't have exactly a ton of land in Easton that is ripe for very large development. Either A, I'm not sure the residents would support that, or B, I'm not sure it's actually feasible from just actually buildable lots that exist in Easton of large size. So to me, in my mind, I'm doing math. Like, can I go get more from new growth? I can probably hope to get 600,000 to 700,000. That's what we've been getting. That means I can't influence the change of the outcome by saying go get new growth. Unless you think we're not doing a good job, and that's okay. We can have those opinions and those conversations. But if we do feel like we're doing a good job, then there isn't much opportunity by saying go get new growth. Does that make sense? And I'm happy for anybody to push back on that. That's what this committee is for.
As a town, we can do a few things to make it easier to increase new growth, i.e. like new construction, permitting, stuff like that. I mean, for one thing, as a contractor, we have some of the strictest wetland law. When in the end, I could just appeal to the state and they overturn anything. And I know for a fact that that hinders a lot of projects, which hinders permitting, which hinders that kind of growth. I know it's minuscule, but it is something that
it's an item.
I appreciate you bringing that up, because I don't know if it is minuscule, but
it adds up quick.
It adds up, and that's an important. That is an important subject that if we want to seriously engage on, we should, as this committee, because much like we touched on CPA or other things, these are trade-offs, right? That the community has made over generations and decades. The upside to a strict wetlands bylaw is obviously a stronger level of environmental protection, a stronger level of protection of the sources of our groundwater that we drink, a higher amount of permanently preserved space. Those are desirable things. On the flip side, to Chris's point, that means it is harder, all other things being equal, to build. Mm-hmm. It means that it is, even if you can build, there is a cost to the permitting that is borne. and businesses are not charities, and so that cost then is reflected in what they sell, right? And I want to be really clear here. I'm not saying my personal opinion one way or another. I'm trying to, in a value-neutral way, say that this kind of starts getting into the thorny issues of showing like these are really hard choices.
Yeah.
And there are no easy, in my opinion. And again, to Tom's point, I want people to challenge my opinions and have that discussion and share theirs. But if there were kind of easy trade-offs we could have made to fix this, we would have. Some of them there were, and they've been baked in, and we're moving forward. We're getting to a point where we need to have those harder contemplations as well.
Well said. Chris, you had your hand raised.
Well, the Target project that comes right before the apartments you're talking about, that didn't take an awful long time for it to build, nor did the Roach brothers. They came in rather quickly, and they were well done. And my years on the planning board, I can tell you there were many times that we butted heads with conservation, and they actually did affect existing subdivisions that could have been bettered by even the town water department wanted particular things done that could have been done, but the conservation would not allow. So there are some times when progress can be hindered by regulations.
Yeah.
And including by design,
Yes.
right? I think that's an important.
But the idea that it takes 14 years in order to have a development, I think it can, especially with sewer, because I can remember when sewer started, we were talking about it, for many years before I left in 2007. But some large projects did come in quick and easy.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. Those are embedded you have to get them to get 600,000 to 800,000. So if you look at the chart that I know came down, we've averaged 600,000 to 800,000 since 2014. That's what we get. And you need to get those one hits to keep that average up.
And I remind you what Kevin Pecos, town administrator, I can't remember when he was, and he would tell us we need to do 1.5 acres of industrial, commercial land to even keep the balance between the residents and the commercial.
Yeah, and so we have, I'm not sure how that translated into the past 10 or 20 years or so, but that has been one of the things that's been particularly challenging is even as we have seen certain retail or commercial develop, is that part of that split, you're referring to the split of our values based on class, right? So Easton is roughly 90% of its property value is residential property. About 10 to 11, it fluctuates, is commercial, industrial, and personal property. And even in years where the new growth was outperformed, so let's say instead of a 90-10 split, new growth was 50-50, part of that valuation is market forces, right? And residential values have been going up 10% a year. So even when we do a decent job delivering on a more diverse kind of portfolio of land, if that makes sense, the existing stock of residential property, even if it were not being improved, just by existing, is going up so quickly that it's hard for us. And this is an excuse to say we need to stop trying. We need to keep doing it. But it's made that very hard to outrun. There are other factors there that are really important, which include that you referenced leaving in 2007 and folks were talking about sewer. It wasn't until 2014 we started building them. And then when we started, we did a few relatively quickly. But that's going to take a very long time to fully maximize benefits. Thank you. And the discussion around what sewer could bring when those plans were starting in maybe the 90s and 2000s, the economy was fundamentally different than where it is now too, right? And so none of that is to say good or bad about any of those plans, but the types of economically viable uses that a developer is going to have on a given piece of land in 2024 are not necessarily the same as 2000.
I think we have actual license and permit
We
revenue
do.
left,
Yeah,
but
sure.
I do want to just make one point that I think Chris brought up that I'm going to ask each of you to think about. One of the things we'll have to yield as a result is the marriage of what we think the town of Easton, the residents of Easton value, and what is important, and how that intersects with the economic cost or revenue stream. So Chris, I'm glad you brought it up the way you did, because we have a value system in Easton, but there are things that are at opposing forces, neither one right or wrong. So I am not giving my opinion, but there are people that love conservation about Easton. Like, that's the most passionate thing to them. And then I have absolutely also heard what Chris said, that look, can be a challenge at times to develop in Easton for some of those values that you hold dear. So there's going to be a lot of those, whether it's when we're talking about public safety, or whether we're talking about education. So don't be uncomfortable about it, but do try to reflect, like, how does Easton, because we have a winning recipe. There's a slide that we don't need to get into, but our value of homes has grown more than surrounding towns. People like it here in Easton. I'm proud of our community. I think we all are. But that interplay of, well, we cause part of this problem because we value that. We should raise that at times. So Chris, I'm glad you raised it. I think we just need to think about that.
I don't want to keep on this too long, but the only reason why I bring that up is I know how it affects things, and we have some very strict rules for a town. And at the end of the day, as a builder, if I'm told no on something and I can appeal to the state, and the state just says, yeah, go ahead and do it. So there's a window there that, to me, it's like, okay, the town just delayed something, or quite honestly, could have caused my homeowner to say, I'm not going to spend the money on engineering and stuff, when the state's going to allow it. So
Sure.
It doesn't paint the town in a very good light either.
Let me use a made-up example. I think our square footage for a lot's 42,000 minimum?
40,000.
40,000, right?
Contiguous upland.
Fair. Let's just call it 40 for math. Hypothetically, as a town, we could be at 20,000 and double the amount of spaces that we could go and build on. I don't think
That causes water problems.
I don't think people want that. I'm not using that to say that,
Tom Broussard.
Chris,
No, but
at
it's-
all,
but-
right?
no, but
Yeah.
that
Is this
is
thing
a
on?
very, that's a
But-
very fair point.
But I need to illustrate that the value system we have to have larger house plots mean we have less housing being built. That's just a choice we made.
Which, in a vacuum, means that tax levy being collected on fewer pieces of property.
At one point, the selectman had suggested we go to 2 acre zoning.
Sure. So again, I use that as a made-up example, entirely fictitious. But that illustrates, Chris, to a point that we in Easton have a certain set of values that reflects in this cost structure, that reflects in these revenue streams that we have. So I just want you all to know you have to think about that. We can't get up there in a vacuum at town meeting and present and not speak to those values. And if we recommend something that's at odds with those, we're going to need to do our homework to illustrate why we are recommending that. And I used a wildly made up exact, can I say that again?
That's one of the I guess you could say, downsides of sewering the whole town. We're sewering particular portions of town. You sewer the whole town, then you can go to 20,000 square foot lots or 5,000 square foot lots. And is that something the town wants to do as well?
So I'll, as long as I'm here, I cannot, the cost of sewering is
The whole
so
town.
astronomical now that I don't, there could be another universe where that happens, but I don't see
Because
it.
that's the reason why it's 40,000 square foot. Because the state did a study, I don't know, in the 70s or whatever it was, that half-acre lots, you couldn't recharge the water well enough to make it viable for a half-acre lot.
Sure.
For a septic system.
So, but that even actually ties in again to this example though, and I'm not here saying get rid of Title V, but that is itself a manifestation of policy.
Yes.
Right? And that is why when you look, and I always find it, and I'm going to get myself in trouble, but it's somewhat ironic that there is a discourse in the public administration field around coming up with new ways to think of new creative ways to zone so that we could bring back the character of insert town name, historic downtown. Zoning did not exist when most of those historic places were built, right? Title V in many cases was not there. I am not suggesting that is in a vacuum a good thing, but if you overlaid a 40,000 square foot lot requirement on most of the neighborhoods surrounding the school complex, none of them would comply, right? And I don't think folks, if given the choice today to hit the reset button, would say that they don't want that denser housing. That's actually a beautiful part of town, right? Has a lot of it's walkable, it's near the schools. So the expansion of lot sizes was in part driven by water, but also in part driven by regulations that said in order for septic to work at a healthier standard, you need more space. So again, I'm not suggesting, I don't want people to walk away and say they're going to get rid of minimum lot size and abolish Title V. We actually don't even have the power to do that. But that is a really important connection that through generations at both the local and state level, we kind of inherit the economic consequences of those things, positive and negative.
I'm going to ask you to get to the last graph. I'm going to ask somebody over there to touch the button. I'm touching my screen. As long as we touch it together,
While
it'll
you're
work.
doing that, just one
I
thing.
just want to do actual license permit revenue, and then I'd love to call a time because we're actually about 20 minutes past where I was hoping to stop at 7.
Sorry, go ahead.
So licenses and permits are, again, not directly causally related, but pretty close to the economic activity in town. There's building permits in there, there's restaurant licenses. Those have grown by 53% from pre-COVID to today. And that's great. The challenge we have, so that's in that local receipt bucket, which is the third largest source of our revenue. The challenge we have is that is a now 7-digit revenue stream growing at 50%, but we have a 9-digit budget. So that can continue growing. It won't, but it would be great if it continued growing at that rate. But if state aid is growing at 1%, that eclipses all of the benefit of that growth. And then there is actually, Tom, your slide right under there, which is showing that we are, and I'm always hesitant in my job to say, oh, look, we're doing everything right. We're not. We could always do better. But values in Easton are growing faster than everyone around us. And I think that is at least in part due to the quality of our services, the quality of our workforce, the quality of the folks who live here, their volunteerism, and the public investments that we've made in infrastructure, schools, and things of that nature.
But the consequence to that, right, if you say it as a consequence, is that tax bills are higher.
They're tied to value.
Because so much of it's residential.
Right. So from an actual license and permit revenue, again, I just frame what the size of the prize could be. Hopefully it continues to grow. Might be a couple $100,000 more next year. It has been relatively flat 21 through 23, give or take. So when you're thinking about the solutions that we're going to put forth in a few months, actual license and permit revenue, I think, is one of those where you say, I hope it kind of continues to grow a little bit like it has been. I'm not sure we could reasonably expect that it'll be a giant leap and we'll get 6 million all of a sudden next year. But maybe maybe we could get a couple 100,000 on average if you looked at historical trends and based upon what we know is about to happen. So the goal of all of the revenue side is to try to give you all a foundation to understand. Look, when somebody says, well, just go get more grants, you can say, well, yeah, but grants, we get them. We do well. We always want to get more, but it's not going to structurally solve a lot of the challenges that we have because of their nature. Go get new growth. We're doing okay. It has dipped after COVID, but candidly, again, new growth is only X opportunity. So same thing with licenses. So if you kind of know the pieces, you can kind of say, can I influence that side of the coin? And if I can, by how much? All right. Sound good? We'll take a break now. It's 7:20, 10 minutes. There's bathroom right around the side here. Is there bathrooms in the second?
Down the hall.
There's one here, the elevator goes up, there's more.
Perfect, since there's all of us. ECAT, if you could put us on pause, I guess, for 10 minutes, that would be great. I would take your mics off before you.
for us is that we went from a locally run civilian dispatch that was run out of a police department to a state-of-the-art facility with a higher level of service, substantially better technology with state revenue getting pulled in because the state, again, talking about using grants and tax policy as incentive structure, the state wants community to start regionalizing 911. It is just way too economically inefficient to have the technology you need on the scale we are at for that. And so we've received millions in state grants over the years to build out SEMREC and operate it. And so the annual operating cost in Easton, with soft costs when you add benefits and things, was close to about $900,000. When in the first 3 years at SEMREC, that operating cost was $300,000. So we were able to save, and I think folks get cynical when you talk about cost avoidance because maybe the number still went up but slightly less, and people quibble over, is that really a cut? In this case, we really did cut dispatch costs from $900,000 to $300,000. And we had been working on that for years, and the timing lined up so that that happened during the pandemic and allowed us, we did still have to reduce staff in other areas, but it allowed us as a community to substantially reduce one of our spending categories and actually end up with a better result. Now, part of that, like the SAFER grant from the fire department, is a staggered grant, and that assessment will ramp up to closer to $600,000 per year. That's where we're heading in fiscal 26. But even if that's the case, if your local costs were $900,000 in fiscal 19 and you're at $600, $650 in 26 for a better service, that's a huge win. So we have netted cumulatively nearly $2 million in operational savings in a 3-year window there. So that's a great example of kind of long-term planning to try to regionalize and either preserve or, when we can, improve services and save money for the community. What ends up happening is we reallocate those funds to other areas of the budget that there are needs. Another example, this is an internal reorganization, is health and community services. Nearly 10 years ago now, there were 4 separate departments: Board of Health, Council on Aging, Recreation, and Veterans Services, that have their own unique areas of jurisdiction and concerns, but a lot of overlap in the kind of human services space. And so those were consolidated into one department under one director, and we've been able to work with the fire department to do mobile integrated health, working with our paramedics to bring nursing services to the community. We've worked with the police department and brought in civilian mental health clinicians, working with the health department, and improved programming there, and are doing it at a lower annual spend today than what those 4 departments separately were costing in 2016. And so the cumulative savings there is nearly $500,000. You're looking at $74,000 to maybe $200,000 a year. That doesn't fix the whole picture, but I think those are good examples or demonstrative examples of us thinking, how do we get creative here to try to reorganize and cut down on spending without just completely shuttering important services for emergency response or vulnerable members of our community. Healthcare, we moved to the GIC in 2016. We saved about $300,000 in that year. That at that time was probably close to 4 to 5% of that fixed cost for the premium of our health insurance budget. We have since then, you can pull market data on what insurance rates, health insurance growth rates have been famously high. No one likes them anywhere in America. That's like one of the few things everyone agrees on. And when you pull information from like the Kaiser Family Foundation, the market growth of comparable plans in this region based on employer surveys was about 4.7% a year over a 10-year window. And our performance with the GIC was closer to 2.75% growth per year. So we cut costs in that 1 year, and then we realized substantial cost avoidance in the successive years. Cumulatively, during fiscal 24, that represents about a $1.3 million delta had we not shifted to GIC. For perspective, the entire town hall operation budget for the year is $2.6 million. So the cost avoidance on healthcare premiums alone in 1 year, not cumulatively, is roughly 1.3. So that's another example of places that we've saved some money. Energy generation and efficiency. So we purchased all the LED lights in town from utilities and converted them. We maintain them. We save about $100,000 per year on that. We generate roughly $350,000 worth of solar net metering credits per year. So that's a great way to not only reduce our carbon footprint, but it saves hundreds of thousands of dollars in costs for the community. We are working to explore feasibility of solar at Blanche Ames to continue to move in that direction. Future police, fire, DPW, if we can, also be looking at solar there. Those will also, right now at least, plan be geothermal, funded through American Recovery Plan or Inflation Reduction Act dollars, so that there's a net zero impact on the capital installation and some savings over time and a reduced carbon impact there. Doing these things and having relatively austere operating budgets allowed us, if you go to page 16 of this report, despite these challenges, to really grow our reserve position. And there's a chart there that shows you, but we went from having free cash and stabilization funds on hand in 2017 that were equivalent to roughly 5% of our operational needs in a year, and we more than doubled that and got it to our policy target, which frankly, when we wrote those policies, was aspirational. To get to having the equivalent of 10% on hand. But I think that's an important point to pause on, that we've made a lot of progress, but even still, the cumulative free cash and stabilization on hand is equal to roughly a month of our spending needs. So it's great to have it there. It was essential in balancing the fiscal 25 budget, but it can't fix it forever.
What are we at now? 6.8?
The balance now post-town meeting is somewhere, I would say, in the mid-6 million range, but don't quote me on that. I'll get a specific number. We hit 7 million, and then we allocated
2.8 or whatever it was.
600 and something thousand, I think.
It looks about 6.2, 6.3 on the slide.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's the first year in the last 10 that we lowered our general stabilization fund balance.
Yeah.
Again, dipped into savings.
And so on that point, this is important too, because there were many hard budgets for both the town and the schools where voters, understandably, were at town meeting saying that they were concerned, whether it was with public safety staffing, whether it was with certain programs at the school, and why are we building our savings instead of addressing these needs? And those were hard discussions, those were hard votes, and had we not stuck to those policies for all those years, we would be in a substantially more financially dangerous spot now. Tom alluded to, there are communities that when these factors all started cresting, for a lack of a better word, this year, went straight for overrides or straight for layoffs, and we didn't have to do either. And that's not to brag, but that's to make the point that there is a long-term direct line between those more austere budgets and the fact that with some challenging economic headwinds, we've been more prepared to at least have the time to think about this proactively than being in a reactive posture.
And there's some towns that had zero stabilization. They had no savings account at all to go back to.
So another area that is inextricably linked to our fiscal position is our wage agreements with our employees. And that's an area, Tom, I thought was really thoughtful at the start of this, pointing out sometimes when folks talk about organizational budgets, they talk about it in the abstract, and it's really important to remember these are talking about human beings who, by and large, are really good workers and come to work and do really important work for everyone in our community every day. They're not just numbers on a spreadsheet. The overwhelming share of our operating departments, it varies a bit on each department, but it's in the high 80s or 90s for some, are salary, because we are human service organizations. And so the wage packages we negotiate have a big impact on the growth. And so I think sometimes folks will say, well, if there's cost pressures on the budget, they must just be giving away the store. The cost of living must be out of this world. And so I think it's important to recognize that in a previous 3-year window, and I'll speak on the town side, 19 through 21, in many cases, the cost of living adjustment afforded to those unions was between 0 and 2% per year. And then in the next 3-year window, after a 1-year extension during COVID, it was 2, maybe 2.5. And that can be a touchy subject, I think. I would love if people didn't all silently look at me while I talk about it alone, but it's important, I think, for the public to hear, and all these things are online too, these wage agreements are not secret. Our budgets have every salary, and these are negotiated in good faith with our unions, and they're also informed by what the market says, right? I think this came up at the first meeting about the comps with maybe private sector comp packages, and it's, if we are trying to hire paramedics, what really is essential to the Easton Fire Department is what can that person with that same skill set get in a nearby community, and are we competitive? And if we're not, we are not going to fill that job, and what we're instead going to do is pay more money to fill it on forced overtime, burning people out, and not
The
saving
reality is, in this day and age, there's such a need for paramedics that, actually I think with the police department too, that they contract shop. They leverage town to town. There's not a lot of, I'm not gonna say loyalty, but like, I grew up in Easton, I'm really not fit to work anywhere else. But there's a lot, it's not like it was 20 years ago, we had a lot of residents. They from all different towns now, and it doesn't matter, especially before they get to know the town and get comfortable, it doesn't matter to them where they work as long as they have a job. So they say, okay, Stoughton pays this much more. So that forces the town to get creative. If the town's not competitive with their salaries, then you lose staff, and it just trickles down. And we got a scare, like 2 summers ago.
And the same is true for schools.
Yeah.
So, and it's a tough problem to solve. But I think folks are pretty respectful in town. But there is, and I think there's sometimes in our current like, well, just cut wages, and then this is fixed, right? And first of all, you can't. It's not legal. These are contracts. But even if you could, set aside the moral implication and all that, you put the community in a disadvantage where you need to be able to attract and retain folks. So we try to balance that. It's a hard
conversation as the decisions that you alluded to before, right? It's the things that make Easton what it is: the open spaces, the conservation, the historical preservation. Those are decisions, but the same thing's true of services. It's safe. The school system is very well regarded. These are things that make Easton what it is. So certainly, decisions can be made to change restrictions, change historical goals, change wages for people, but it will change the fabric of the town. So those are just the decisions that need to be presented, and people will have to choose what their values, as you called them earlier, what their values are for the town.
So point of emphasis for everybody for a takeaway, just try to make these call-outs. So on the expense side, we heard that the largest expense that we have is people. And the largest group of people are contractually bound from a unionization standpoint. So your ability to impact that, us, is not easy, right? It's not in the private world where you're like, oh, gonna cut 20%. Been a part of that. That just happens, and people get notified, and you go through the process. That is, I just want to highlight the little dots on the other side of the coin that make it less easy for us to go and resolve. If high 80s to mid 90% of your budget, every single one of your dollars goes to people, and most of that is inflexible, at least in a short term via contracts and unionization, then it makes it difficult to impact the largest expense driver. So just want to make a mental note.
With the exception of reductions in force and layoffs.
Correct.
And that's going to tie into when we get into the per capita spend and some staffing analysis is that much as this is not necessarily a result of overly generous negotiations with labor, it is not a result of having extra staff that are fluff either. And so that's why I wanted to emphasize that point and get to it.
Good call.
And again, and just to make sure it doesn't sound as if it's not as if those things have been treated off limits. We have in times of major economic challenge cut positions because you do have to balance the budget. We do not want to do that, but that is something that does happen. As I mentioned before, and I can't emphasize enough, all of these factors have led to more and more of a reliance on the property tax revenue of Easton just to sustain service. And so that has resulted in increased costs of living. We have worked through a variety of programs. Town meeting voters have been very generous. Think about when ARPA first hit, when COVID first hit, before there was federal relief, voters in Easton were putting forward their own money through CPA for rent relief programs. And I think that's really a special thing. Think about what a hard spot people were in at that time, and that was a priority for voters. We've made some advantageous choices. We bulk purchase electricity for the entire town. If you pay electricity in town, you can see the supplier on the back. We locked into a 10 cent per kilowatt hour rate back in 2020. I think it was January of 2020, so we got fortunate on that. And so there was over $11 million of cost avoidance of utility savings for ratepayers in Easton in a 3-year window just in the past 12 months, where National Grid, had we not done this program, had you been paying 30-something cents per kilowatt hour, in the past 12 months, the average residential home in Easton saved $1,200 in energy costs. That probably got gobbled up somewhere else in the cost of living, right? In folks' grocery bills or other things, but it's a good thing that we were thinking about that and doing programs like this. We use some of that federal relief money. Voters established as part of passing Blanche Ames a taxation aid committee that was going to be driven by donations. And we were able to work with federal auditors and say, that committee exists, the framework exists. Let's take federal money for financial relief during the pandemic. And we have put more than $250,000 out the door to seniors and individuals with disabilities to defray property taxes and keep them in their home. We have established a similar fund called SERVE, which is supporting every resident veteran of Easton, which can pay up to $1,400 per household per year for food, fuel, utility, and other costs for veterans and their dependents. And we've allocated $100,000 plus out through that program using federal grants as well. Finally, most recently, as part of voters, again, very generously passing the Police Fire Public Works project, we adopted a local circuit breaker program where we will have, for a period of a few years, a quasi-local match to the state circuit breaker tax credit, which is for certain income qualified seniors. It's a state level tax credit for folks that recognizes that local taxes are going up and up and up. That helps take some of that pressure off on seniors on a fixed income. So for whatever, I think it's worth a lot, but I think it's important, and I don't like to have a conversation about we have revenue needs, we have program needs without acknowledging that there's a direct financial impact on residents who are often not necessarily at the table for this conversation. So it'd be unlikely that anyone of them are watching. I want them to know that's always top of mind, and we've worked hard to put those programs together. Everything else in this report, I think folks have had time to look at. We can just get right into the community comp report unless there are questions. I don't know if anyone had any questions about the kind of cost-saving things we just touched on. Okay. So this is the second document for the night, the Community Expenditure Comparison Report. If anyone was reading closely, you'll notice it's for fiscal year ending June 30, 2022. That's because we pulled this from the State Department of Revenue and their data lags a little bit. I've contacted them and asked when the next round is available, and it's November. We will update it. But as is noted in here, the trends have been kind of progressing for years. So this is a document that we started doing, I'm not exactly sure, in 2012. And it takes publicly available data. And again, if you go to the committee website, and for folks at home, it's easton.ma.us/PASE, we have a direct link to it. The state has a lot of really great public data portals available, and there's one that's called the Community Comparison Report. And it allows you to pull any number of financial indicators about all 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts. And so benchmarking is standard practice, I think, at any kind of well-run organization. It gives you a more objective measure of what are our spend behaviors rather than looking at ourselves year over year. compared to our peers. And so tonight I'd like to just talk about the town side of this equation and answer questions and hopefully have a good conversation. So right out of the gate, I always feel like I have to give the obvious caveat. I don't purport that this is a perfect methodology. I'm open to hearing alternative ones. But there is some value to using the same methodology over a period of time to get apples to apples longitudinal comparisons. And so that's why we have stuck with this. We tried to use certain data points as proxy for community feel, right? So we take the 4 metrics. We look at population, average single family tax bill, income per capita, and equalized valuation per capita. That means the per person value of land in a community, and take communities that are between a 10% swing. So Easton's the middle, or Easton's 100. Anyone who's at 90 or 110% of those values gets in the group, or 2 or more of those in the group. Communities that are more than 40,000 or less than 15,000, or have a population density that's more than double ours, we eliminate. And so what that gets us is a group of what we call core communities. And it shifts slightly over time as communities move and shake and do their own things. Some people come out of a group, some come back. But our comps are, from that kind of economic perspective, Ashland, Canton, Chelmsford, Dedham, Foxborough, Mansfield, Marshfield, and Walpole. We also, although it's not necessarily as relevant from an economic benchmarking standpoint, we also always include in this, what are our neighboring towns doing? Because when you're communicating, I think, with the public, I think most people are going to think of like, okay, well, what's Norton doing? What's Sharon doing? So those are included in here too. Another caveat, I'm not suggesting per capita spend is a perfect metric. There are others you could look at, but for town side services, particularly schools often use per pupil because that's a more focused direct correlation compared to a more general town service, but it is a controllable one that you can leverage over time. So that's why we use it. And so the broad takeaway, and all these tables are in the report, and I suppose, Tom, if you want to bring that up on screen, you certainly could. Okay. Page 5 of the community comp report. Easton's total spending per capita, so that's our entire budget, inclusive of school, town, fixed costs, everything, is beneath both the median and the mean per capita spending for our core communities and our neighboring communities, ranking 5th out of 6 among our neighboring communities and last among our 9 communities. Our education per capita spending ranks 5th amongst our contiguous neighbors, so 5th out of 6, and last out of the 9 core communities. General government spending, which is your town hall departments, ranks last among all of our neighbors and all of our economic peers, spending half as much per capita on those departments than our peers. This has actually declined since 2017, and as part of feedback from Budget Subcommittee on some of these reports, we polled the report for all 351 cities and towns. Again, I think sometimes when you're in a tough budget cycle, folks have a feeling of, okay, well, what have you done to cut the fat? What about mid-management or those administrative jobs? Easton's general government per capita spend is the lowest of any town in all of Massachusetts. We are 5th from the bottom in the entire state. And I don't say that as a point of pride. Our folks do a great job. They do, the phrase do a lot with less sounds trite, but when you're spending less than half as much per capita and you are spending the least of any town in the state, I think we talked about this in the first meeting. We don't want to discourage people asking questions about individual programs or spends or jobs, but we have finite time between now and May, and we should be thoughtful about how much can be squeezed out of a given area of spend if that's where it is comparatively. So that's where general government ranks. Police department is last among our neighbors, second to last among our peers in the core group. Fire department is 5th of the 9 core communities, second to last amongst our neighbors. Public works spending per capita is 6th of 9 core communities, second to last compared to our neighbors. The disparity between Easton's spending on a total, an actual budget basis, and a per capita basis with that and our economic peers has grown. We did not do one of these reports for a few years because pandemic, and it was basically an emergency and we weren't in that time. And the last time we had done this was for fiscal year 2017. Those disparities have grown. If you go to the next page on page 6, you will see that, where continuously from 2012 to 14 to 17 to 22, the total spend has declined from Easton being at a negative at 11% below the average budget spend of our peers to most recently at negative 14.6. And when you try to normalize that on a per capita basis, we went from 14% below what our peers were doing to now 16% below. When you say, okay, great, that's a ton of numbers, what does that actually mean? If you were to say, well, we have a similar amount of residents, maybe similar amount of road miles, we want to compete with them, what if we spent at the same rate as those communities, our budget would need to increase by $18 million. I'm not suggesting that because it's not feasible and because I would like to not be fired. But I think it conveys the scale of what we are talking about. Then this report goes through each of those relative departments. I'll skip to the conclusions. I already touched on reserves that while we've made a lot of progress, we still trail our peers in that area. So in my view, I think that's sufficient shorthand to say we did not arrive at this comparative reduced operating spend level because we over prioritized reserves. I think that's fair, but I'm happy to talk more about that. And so the conclusions here, and this was done early in the budget cycle in January of this year, because it's important for elected officials, school committee, select board, finance committee, and residents to understand our budgets on both an actual total spend and a per capita spend level are very lean, such that adding services is very unlikely. We've been using most of our efforts just to maintain where we are now. Our economic peers are spending have far outpaced us, whose their average total budgets in fiscal 22 were 123 million. We this year reached 110, 3 years after them, despite them having comparable community sizes and populations. And again, we've weathered the Great Recession, the pandemic. We have budgeted these operations very conservatively. We've tried to save money in some of the areas that I touched on, which was not a exhaustive list. So I suppose I will do the opposite of what I did in the last report. I will not take 2.5 hours of your night on it. I hope we could have a good discussion about it. I provided a supplemental document to folks as well, which was what the staff levels are in Easton's biggest town departments, right? Because the total spend, the per capita spend, those are important data points. But what does that actually translate to? And so you have police department staffing, fire department shift staffing, and DPW staffing. And this is representative of staffing today in fiscal 25. And you can see our department heads pulled the data from that same peer group. And you could see Easton's in blue at the top. You could see the population in the total sworn officers, the amount FTE means full-time equivalent, so that's the amount of full-time equivalent positions per 1,000 residents. How many civilian administrators we have. Again, I think that's a really important opportunity for education where some folks may sometimes feel uncomfortable asking of like, well, is it because the positions are going to management? And so that's in here as well. Civilian admin, deputy chiefs, lieutenants, sergeants. And then you can get down to the bottom, you see the average Easton and where we are on a percent spread as far as the differential. And so I glossed over, but I said where we rank, but if you look at those spending per cap statistics, take the police department and you can see Easton table 5 back in fiscal 22, our per capita spending difference is about 14% below our peers. Our total officers 22% below our peers. And you can see that's particularly exacerbated in civilian administration and lieutenants, where our peers on average have 3.5. Lieutenants, we have 1. There are very real operating impacts of that. That means that you have you are expecting more of an exercising of a span of control on fewer leadership positions for life, safety, and critical departments. Then if you even look at surrounding towns, which are not necessarily economic comps through that methodology, you see the spread there is much different. But even still, you could see a real disparity on the leadership level staffing. And we are at the mean of that group because there is one town with only 7,000 residents that pulls that down. But so that I think is important to see. Fire department, these stats look at shift staffing. Happens to be a firefighter sitting at a table with me, so I will get fact checked if I'm wrong, and Chris, please jump in. But Chief felt this was an important metric to look at because this is really indicative of the amount of folks who are on the line available day to day in the event of an emergency. There's a variety of things that impact minimum staffing per shift, including not just your total FTE for the department, but contractually negotiated minimum staffing, time off, things like that. And so this shows where those minimum fire department staff levels are per shift. In Easton, we have 4 groups. So the minimum is 8 per 4 group who have to be working. And then this is sorted and ranked by the resident to shift staff ratio. And then you could also see, similar to the police, a shift staff per 1,000 resident ratio, and where Easton it differs, right? And so we have, for every firefighter in our minimum staffing, there's 3,100 residents. And in other communities, the average is 2,500. That's a 20% difference. When you normalize it on a per 1,000 resident basis, it's a 33% spread. This is also, when you go back to the expenditure comparison report, the fire department is one of the comparatively less far behind departments at 5%. But one of the things that's important there too is we carry the ambulance costs in our fire budget, and not every town does. So that masks that to an extent.
And our call volume is higher than.
Our call volume has
Way
increased
higher than
dramatically
most of the other
in both police and fire. And when I say that, I don't mean to say that means that it's necessarily all these calls are related to a crime occurring. And correct me if I'm wrong, but even just behavior from before to after the pandemic, and it's good. If people think there's an emergency, they should call 911, right? But folks call 911 an extraordinary amount.
Everything.
Right? And the fire department is now doing 4,000 runs per year, medical, right?
On Friday, we had four separate instances where you had 2 or 3 medicals all at once. And for whatever reason, they were all legit. So we had other towns, and it was the strangest thing, but that happens all the time. When one ambulance goes out, the other one goes out. And when we're at our minimum and both ambulances go out, then there's very, very little fire protection left for the town. And the way that Good Sam has been hospital-wise, the ambulance could be at the hospital for 2 hours. So
there's a direct connection between those reduced and extremely lean per capita and actual spend levels to a more challenged position for our staff.
Justin, could you hit the screen when we're thank you. We time out every so often. Sweet, thank you.
And also, I just want to note, I want folks to engage in this conversation, and if there's deep dive stuff, we are happy to bring some of the department heads in at a later meeting and talk into more operational detail, but I wanted to kind of give the higher level. And the last one I want to point out is DPW. DPW is challenging to get comps on because DPWs do very different things in every community. And we made some notes here. Some communities have private water utilities, some have large sewer divisions, some have no sewer divisions, some do trash, some contract that out, some have beaches. So it's kind of hard to get an exact comp. But even taking the mean, which is relatively crude, we are below that. And when we have done through things like the operational audit years ago, division by division level staffing analysis, Public Works is extraordinarily lean in the town of Easton. And our buildings and grounds crew maintains an enormous amount, an enormous footprint. Think about the fields and parks, all town and school facilities with a very, very small, they're highly skilled, the guys are awesome, but we are not remotely staffed at where we ought to be in those divisions, and I think these numbers reflect that as well, as do the total spend in the comp report. So I hope we can have a good conversation around this, because this is kind of really where the rubber hits for roads. So I'm happy to get feedback. And
I'm going to do something real quick too, if that's okay.
Sure.
And this is an eye chart, but I do have copies. I only have 10, so you can share. Meet your neighbors. That might be roughly half. And again, if you guys could just buddy up. So,
Is this from the data analytics website?
yeah, it is.
this is?
Yeah, I pulled this from DOR, which, well, no, hold on, to be clear. This is a curated one Tom has.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough, but there are extra columns manually added in here where they don't do the per capita and stuff, so I do think.
So, I'm a born and bred numbers person, and one of the things I learned a long time ago is to try to ensure we make it real for our audience. Because we can use percents all the time and we can talk per capita, but I also want to make sure we walk away with a functional grasp of what Connor just said. Because in a nutshell, what he just gave you was a very large portion of the other side of the coin. And I want to make sure we all understand it. And this grid, I think, will help you. So all I did was take public information that's available. Connor provided it, but it's online. You can get it, and I've done it in the past. And I took the 10 communities that have, so we have 25,247 residents. I took the 10 that were just below us and the 10 that were just above us. It is just based on population. So to Connor's point, a little bit more sophistication could be how much square acres do you have, road miles. But to me, this is a similar size, and it's 20 data points. I can tell you categorically 20 data points is statistically relevant. So when Connor says, for example, general government is the lowest, we spend $99,000, that's the first green column, that's general government per capita, or in total, the column right before it, 2.5 million.
Just to be clear, we spend 99 per cap.
Per cap, correct.
Yeah, not 1,000, 99,000.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, 99.
Sorry.
Sorry.
We'd have some pretty cool stuff if we did.
Right, well done. Sorry, $99, sorry. And the general government total is 2.5 million. So it's that total I want you to focus on. Because if you look down the rest of the list at all the communities, they average spending 6.2 million. Right? So when we talk about how lean we are, 2.5 versus an average of 6.2, and then some people who are smart could say, oh, you're using the average, that's one, brings it all up. No, the next closest, I believe, if I have it sorted right, is Wakefield at 2.9, then 3.8 million in Marshfield. So it's a pretty tight range, and statistically that's important, right? This isn't just one community spends 50 million and the rest are all low. This is we materially spend less in general government. So when he says per cap of 99, and the average is 240, that's not real to me. Like, I get it. It's math. It's a math number. We spend 2.5 million and the rest spends 6.2. So this is where I look at Connor, and you should all ask this. Well, is there any structural reason? Do you get a $4 million grant from the Tooth Fairy? We don't. But you should ask those questions. Like, is there a structural reason why we're so less? No. I think on average, we do a lot more with a lot less. So I'm just gonna go through the rest and I'll go quick. But to make it real, we spend $5 million on police, and the average, if you look at it, is 6.6 million. That's where we're 1.6 million under, or 24% under the average of other people. Fire, we spend 5.4. Again, to Connor's point, the average is 5.6. We're under by 5%, at least here as its average spend. Public safety, other, we're under by 26%, so we spend 629 grand. Other people spend 852 grand on average. Here's a good one, so not for today, but planting the seed for next edition, super excitement, next meeting. Education, we spend 44.7, average is 52.1. We spend 14% under on average for education versus similar sized communities. Public Works, 6.5 million, I'm sorry, 4 million versus 6.5 million average. So we spend 40% less on Public Works, to Connor's point. Human Services, we spend 231 grand less at 823 grand, or 22% less. Culture and Recreation, we spend 655 grand versus 2.1 million average, 68% less. So fixed costs, which I honestly genuinely don't know, is the one place what falls into that bucket versus other buckets.
Health insurance and pension assessments.
There you go. So we spend more, 1.2 million or 9% versus the average of 14.2. I think that's the rare place, if I remember. Intergovernment. Not sure what that happens to be.
I'm not sure what DOR uses to code it, but it could be things like regional school assessments, cherry sheet assessments for charter sending and things like that.
Fair. So we spend 42% less, 1.1 million versus 2. Other expenses, we spend 142 grand, average is 353, 60% less. Debt service, pretty comparable, 5 million. Debt service is good, right? Like, hey, do we have a problem operationally because we don't incur debt? That could be a problem, right? Like, we're just spending all our cash and we don't have debt. That's not true. Debt is a healthy thing when done right. It enables you to invest so that you get returns faster. It's what America, in some arguments from a financial perspective, is built on. But we're pretty normal. 5 million versus 5.4 million, 6% under. So I just want to make it real, because if we go around to all the people we know and we say, well, per capita, it's 199. I love it. You know, I geek out on stats. I'm not knocking it. But when you start saying, look, we actually spend 14% less on education. We happen to have a high school that just got ranked 34th. We split the difference.
Which is
but
top 25%.
Right?
Yep.
So, like, there are 351 communities. Our high school is in 34th out of all of them, and we spend 14% less. This all just gets back to, if any one of these expense accounts is a sponge, and you choose in your assessment that you want to ring it, appreciate what you're ringing from. There's all those adages, you can't get water from a stone. I'm not saying any of these are stones, but to me, this makes it real that how efficient we have been on the expense side in a lot of ways. It absolutely does not mean we don't ask questions. It doesn't mean we don't challenge. It doesn't mean we don't look for nickels, turn in cans to find them, whatever we can do. But to me, this is a huge piece. And I think when we look at the school side in a couple weeks, that you're going to see an awful lot of similarities, candidly, because I already know the end of the day answer. I already know we spend less than our peers. Maybe per pupil is different, so maybe I shouldn't be using a per capita, getting us all in trouble. But you guys see where I'm hopefully going with this, if it makes sense. So I can share this after the fact. I wanted you guys to have the printout just so you could kind of see it, even if you had to use my readers to do so. But does this make it realer for you all than just the percentages in the per capita? Mm-hmm. Is it helpful? Like, does it? Cool. Because I definitely want to start, and I think Connor set the stage, I want to start challenging all of you collegially to start asking these questions. Like, so for 5 years I've studied this, 6 years I think-ish, going back to budget subcommittee. So like, I get it, and I love this stuff. So I'm great at financials, P&Ls, reading public statements, but I want to make sure I know it comes easy to me. I need to make sure you folks get it, and then you tell all your friends, and we can communicate at a town meeting, if that makes sense. So have at it. Like, how do we help inform you about these town departments so that you can ask questions? The good news is, again, we have somebody from the fire department here, so that's helpful. Like, it makes it real, so to speak. I'll pause.
Well, I have a question.
Please.
Do I have to turn this button on? That's not
It's green, you're good.
So do we know, so when we're comparing to these other communities, but we've said that Easton is a largely residential community. So some of these communities, you know, like Dedham, I think there's that huge shopping center, that whole commercial area, that we don't have that in Easton. So that to me is not perhaps, you know, exactly apples to apples.
Agreed.
And I know this isn't and can't be a perfect comparison, But I do wonder, like, do we know the revenues of these other towns? Because I think that would be an important data point.
In fact, I pulled those up because I was looking at this on the website that you mentioned, and I pulled up Canton and Stoughton as just a basic example. And if I'm reading this correctly, please, significantly smarter person than me, Connor. The commercial levy, for instance, is the commercial tax base for the town of Canton, independent of the industrial levy of the town of Canton. The commercial levy is $14 million in Canton. The commercial levy for us is $4 million. So it's a significant difference. Stoughton, I'm actually surprised, is at 12 million, right? The industrial base for Canton is 16 million, ours is 1.9. So you're right, it's a significant apples to oranges comparison, but it's something that
Well, just
it
highlights
comes back
our
in all the
problem.
pieces. Yeah.
And if I could, the only thing I'll say is apples to oranges at times here, specific. But go back to what Connor did, and I could easily do it here against surrounding communities and peer communities. And where, if you remember the 5 of 9, last of 9, nowhere are we above the average. Mm-hmm. We're below 50% ranking. And so, to your point, a good exercise might be to I think that's what Connor's exercise does. This just does it off population. But we can make it just pure apples to apples as well. And wherever we think that is, because Connor's does it, we're going to be the lower half of that quartile distribution.
I don't even think the point on revenue takes away from this, because clearly, even just the number of people, I mean, like your example about the Friday phone calls, that has nothing to do with the commercial industrial buildings in the town. So I think that it's an important data point for comparing, but
good point.
It's not taking away from
Agreed.
your message.
I think we should just articulate that, though, because I think, that's what, if I wasn't presenting this, that's what my job is usually, is let me try to make sure we're poking holes so that we don't have some unintended bias. So I think it's a fair point. I think it's okay to show this to illustrate the conversational point, but we can also show it with very similar communities without that commercial base, just to illustrate that too.
Yeah, I mean, it also is supporting and illustrating the point of why we have this problem, because our town's just not making as much money as these other towns that have the same needs, because we have the same population, the same number of people to service, same number of students in the schools, but we're not making enough as much revenue.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think an important part there is that ties back into the kind of policy and value choices over time, right? Where even if we wanted to now shift to those spreads, right, of maybe the commercial base is 25 or 30% of our land value, would folks, and it's a thought experiment, so you can't do it overnight, but would folks want to trade away the open space for Xfinity, right?
Yeah.
And that's a very real example, right? And so if you look at just the Sound towns, Norton, Easton, Foxborough, Mansfield, 2 communities have stadiums and 2 have colleges. Colleges are institutionally exempt from taxes, right? I don't know if, maybe it gets you to a solve on revenue, but I don't know if you gave, and I'll make it about a different town because I don't want to get in trouble with anyone, but like, I don't know if you gave folks the choice of like swap out a beautiful liberal arts educational institution with a stadium, if folks would say, oh yeah, let's do it. So, but that's a really important point to illustrate that we are 100% behind the 8 ball on commercial development because we didn't even start doing sewer construction until decades after most of these communities.
And that was by design, because back in the
There was an
70s, when the state was funding sewer, Easton didn't want it because they didn't want the development. They wanted to remain a farming, agricultural type of a community and stop the impact of the business growth. So
Something you said before that I don't know that this exists, but I want to ask the question, which is you said that we are a levy to the max community, but communities that have that bigger commercial tax base, Natick might be the example that I immediately thought of, right? Okay. Natick Mall, that entire Route 9 corridor, they're not levying a full 2.5% at every single instance of property tax, right? Because they don't have to necessarily.
I have no idea if that's the case.
Thinking of it from a thought standpoint. There are communities that don't levy completely across the board to 2.5%.
I would say those are check if I can.
We're in the western part of the state.
Yeah, but I actually think that that would probably be the exception to the rule. Communities typically do the 2.5% plus new growth.
Just because they have it.
Just because they have it, they can. And it's, even in those communities, maybe comparatively better situated in some ways, there's certainly unfunded needs there as well,
Yeah,
right?
of course.
So there are some who don't, or some who do what's called an underride, where you vote to cut the levy, but that is not typical.
I wouldn't say that too loud.
That's okay. People can have that conversation.
And to bring it full circle, thank you, Connor, again for doing this last step. The reason why he did the comparison across the departments for people are 85 to 95% of our expense. So when you're looking at these, by having that, it informs, like, do we just have too many people? It doesn't seem it by at least that effort that was done to compare FTEs, shifts in the fire department, so on and so forth. So I don't want you to think we didn't get into any granularity. Actually, credit to your department heads for going through that effort and calling around to make that happen. That's not public. It's not an easy download, so to speak. That's hugely informational for us because it's our biggest expense in these buckets. Does anybody?
I'm just going to make a comment that I do think that the presentation that we end up with really needs to inform the community about how the town's values, the history of those values, and the history of decision-making around keeping it a farming community, not supporting sewer, not supporting development, is really important to get to where we are. You know, I've lived in this town for 28 years, and I think even attending town meetings and things, you get the financial aspect, and you hear this conversation in, you know, many of the other settings that we are part of in town, but I think that's a really important part. You know, it's sort of our history and our values that have, in many respects, gotten us here. There are some other things like the Chapter 70 funds and that formula and stuff, but you know, people I think need to recognize that. Excuse me?
The perfect storm.
Yes, yes.
Good point.
I would agree. So I think that would be, it's really helpful to sort of establish that even prior to getting into some of these numbers.
So just to be nice, I am going to ask everybody to opine. So before I call on people, I'll let other people raise their hands who might have had comments. But then I am going to ask everybody if you wouldn't mind just sharing your thoughts on what we presented regarding the expenditures, because I really do think it's important for us to hear from everybody. So who wants to go next?
I do actually have a lot of questions, probably. If you were here during our first meeting, I had a lot of questions. But when we're doing comparisons to other communities and that they are spending more per person per capita than Easton, is there evidence that they are materially better off, receiving better response times, having more from the fire departments, police departments, more higher educational scores, things of that nature that prove? I mean, this is basically telling us, in layman's terms, that there's an incentive to potentially increase taxes at some point for Easton, whether we need to or we want to. And I guess I just don't see the evidence. I see the evidence we're spending less, and I think there's a good portion of the population that doesn't have a problem with that. And I don't understand, without understanding the outcomes or the benefits of that extra spend, how are you going to convince people to essentially increase their own taxes?
Sure. So it depends on which department, right? So schools have not necessarily universally agreed upon metrics, but you can look at MCAS graduation rates, educational attainment, things like that, where Easton often does, I think probably nearly universally, outperform its spend level. And so I think, and tell me if I'm being too presumptuous, what's buried in that question is like, is it necessarily a bad thing if we're still having good service output, right? Is that fair?
To some extent.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, so certain departments that have like state aggregated data, they have that. There's not like a state clearinghouse on response time data, but what we can do is on the larger departments, have those folks come in and talk about what this actually looks like for their operational impact and what they are not doing that they should be doing. And then as we get close to fiscal 26, the conversation is not just going to be about kind of taking these moments in time of where are these spend levels that are now in the past. It's going to be what happens to our current service level if we have to cut even more. So that's where that's important. So it's not just, are those folks necessarily better off? Because it's a good question, but outside of those state level statistics, this committee will have to be selective with where you think your time is best spent going on that, because you could spend years on that one question. How do you define better off? I think we probably showed one way you look at what the market is telling you, and people are willing to spend more at a growing and faster rate to come here than in some of those communities, which may reinforce the hypothesis of perhaps it's not, those things aren't linked and it's not as big of a problem. So we would need to be thoughtful about where are the areas, and I think public safety are areas that I think are worth spending some time on. Perhaps public works. I don't want to put Chris on the spot, but you could, I'm sure, give some examples of. Here's a direct example. When you have fewer firefighters staffed per shift, even if your staff are better trained or more qualified in providing a high level of service, sometimes it's just about numbers. And when you have multiple calls, there's only so many firefighters you could put on ambulances and respond to scenes. And once you hit that, which in Easton is not hard to do because of the comparatively low shift staffing, you have to rely on mutual aid and call folks in from other communities. And that is a materially longer response time. Instead of talking 3 to 5 minutes.
So we operate on what's called a 2 and 2 out rule. So if we pulled up to a structure fire, and let's say it's during the day, it's unoccupied, the house on fire and everything like that, we're typically not going to make entry. The first 2 guys in the engine company that get there, they're gonna have their hands full anyways, but the theory is to not go in until you have 2 guys out to back up in case something goes south inside the building. Now, it's all bets are off if you get reported to somebody inside or whatever like that, but still, 2 guys pulling up without backup it's terrible. And the one thing, been my experience with overrides and trying to sell them or whatever, I will educate anybody on whatever's going on with police, and even, fire and can even help out with police, but and I think Connor will agree, we don't want to sound like we're threatening either.
Correct.
You know what I mean? Because that's a big turnoff.
Yeah.
And a lot of residents, I've sat through a lot of town meetings, like, oh, they're just doing the same old threats again, and it's like, no, this is legit what's going to happen. So, but.
Yeah, and I appreciate that point. And if that was my tone at any point, I apologize. That is not, I think, what I'm trying to convey, or Tom, having worked with him long enough, feel comfortable speaking for you, that this automatically means catastrophe. It doesn't.
It's just education.
But what it does mean is that we are, in a lot of these metrics, in a materially weaker position to weather the economic challenges that we have good reason to think are coming. We know we are staffing leaner, spending less in a lot of these, probably nearly all departments, but it's certainly the biggest ones, and that has a direct translation to response capabilities. And that because of our efforts in the past decade plus to reorganize and shave expenses where we can and cut positions where we can, the balance and the challenge is talking about it in a real way that if you wanted to kind of cut your way out of the problem, you're going to see material negative impacts to things like response times or ability to review permits and get projects going, which then turns into a negative feedback loop of less development, less growth. It's hard to say exactly this will happen. And I think folks who do that run the risk of Chris's point sounding like we're threatening or doom casting. I think Easton is a good community. We have a lot of fundamentals in our favor. In my personal judgment, the sky is not falling, but it is a very real question of we have a set of services today. Every one of 25,000 people who live here probably have a different experience of what that means to them, whether they think they're great, whether they don't, whether they see value, whether they don't. And what we're trying to talk about is that there's a very real likelihood that these factors we're starting to spend some time digging into are going to mean that service level will start to decline. How it does, through which departments, what that directly manifests into, we can spend time, and we should, on probably some of the biggest ones, and people should think about that. in a way that perhaps you think like, I would look to you and ask you, what is a data point that's achievable and helpful to communicate that, right? So you start with that idea is good. Are folks better off? Well, that's hard to quantify. So what's an area where perhaps we could look to use data that's available as a proxy for that? That could be informative in a way that's not just spreadsheets saying we're behind the 8 ball, everything's bad. Because I don't think that's what we're necessarily trying to do.
And if I can, let me see if my mic's on. I remember my first town meeting was like 20 years ago, and I remember being surprised by there was almost a pride in the room about how well we do with how little we spent. It was seen by many, many voters as a positive that we are underspending our peers and aren't we doing a great job. And there's some truth to that, right? I think we've spoken about this before and have probably brought it up in a town meeting that if you two were CEOs and getting the results you're getting with the budgets you're getting, you'd be celebrated. But it doesn't work that way when you're talking about government and services and schools. So I think we have to be aware of that sentiment, right? There's kind of that Yankee frugality, right, that we all have as hardy New Englanders, and we can do more with less, and that's a badge of honor. Recognizing that and balancing it with, again, like really laying out, okay, but these are the results that we can expect from various choices that get made over time. So
The per capita stuff, I think, is incredibly educational and will be, because it's no secret that we're educationally or on the municipal side, we're lower per capita spending all the way around. What does that tell you? That tells you that there is very little to cut that's not going to have a great negative impact.
One of the things, just to frame for everybody, is, do we have a problem now? Because you're right. If we steady state, we just say that's okay. I think we still have a problem because we use $700,000, $600,000 worth of our savings. Meaning, no matter what, I feel we have a problem now. So I also agree with Connor and his previous sentiments. I don't think anybody is talking about going all the way to the average, for a lot of reasons, because we seek to provide value. We do well with what we have. We're incredibly talented people. We run lean. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I would ask the team, as you go through this process, to think about what is the size of the problem. So the first thing I will ask, does anybody think we don't have a problem? Okay. So by not saying anything, we have all just agreed we have some problem. So now it's a design, an exercise of to what degree and how would I solve it, either on the expense side or the revenue side. Everything's open. But I just want to make sure we are all aligned. We have a problem. Okay.
I would agree, based on the sentiments of this room, that is true, but I do not feel that is the perspective of the town.
Fair.
So that is what I think we're up against.
That's good. That's a great point to illustrate. Jim?
I feel as though the challenge, as you've said, is either and or probably both an revenue and expense problem, or at least that would be the perception of the town, is we're going to ask for, in theory, to resolve a revenue side problem, ask for an override, an operational override potentially. That's one option that we could go with. I think it would be relatively vague or risky to say, we need this money to fix a problem, but we're not going to tell you specifically or within some certain realm, like this is what we're going to spend it on. Like fire and police, people advocate.
You have to tell them.
You do need to. Yeah, if we get there, and I don't want folks at home watching to say, oh, the fix is in and that's what they're doing. It's a great point, and we're not there yet, because I definitely would not presume, even if everyone on the committee agrees there's a problem we have to fix, that's the route you all individually would want to go. Because that's a really big step just to take that. And then once you're there, it's, okay, to your exact point, where does that actually go? Because you certainly, and I wholeheartedly agree, you couldn't go to voters and say, well, we've roughly quantified this structural problem at $3 million, so do that and trust us. I agree. Yeah.
Well, I guess because I feel like a lot of the documentation we've gone through, even calling it a structural revenue deficit, implies that it's a revenue, leading the conversation into that it's a revenue
It is.
problem. Yeah.
100%. I am leading that conversation.
Right, but that leads to revenue side solutions, I would say, or preempts the conversation towards a revenue side solution.
That's fair. I would respectfully disagree, because if that were the case, we would just put an override on the ballot tomorrow.
Right.
We don't need this committee to do that.
But because we have to sell an override
No,
to the
I-
population.
No, I think
If we
we're-
go that route, we have
I'm
to
just
sell
being
an override.
open-minded. Like I don't think we've gone through the details enough to know if the solution should come from the expense side or the revenue side. I know the problem originates on the revenue side, but that doesn't mean the solution, in my mind, lies on that side.
Not a long-term solution.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
think people who are familiar with this budget and these long-term implications would know that an override won't be a long-term solution.
Correct.
We're kicking the can.
Yeah, no, but I hear your point that and by virtue of my position, I am framing the conversation. And I am. And I feel very confident in that with my experience and having worked on this, but I'm not saying it's unassailable or I'm infallible. And I think that is, to the extent anything is being sold, I hope you take it sincerely from me. That's why we're doing this, is because I'm sure there are a lot of folks who would look at that and say, okay, yeah, he can put town seals on it and make it, this is what's happening, and I don't necessarily agree. I want people to say, I don't know if I agree, and understanding I will challenge you back and say, okay, well, show me where we're wrong. That's also, I mean that sincerely, that I don't think that is automatically the solution, because to Dr. Cabral's point, even if that's the route the community ultimately decides to go, it's not a long-term one. Yeah. And I think at the very first meeting, I acknowledged that having spent my career in municipal government, being on state financial policy committees, I am the last person on earth who would defend the entire financial structure we have to work with, because it's fundamentally not sustainable. But it is the laws that we have to work with, and so I don't want my framing of it to be said that it's automatically gospel. It isn't. We can talk more about it. I guess what I'm trying to convey is, when you look at it in a more macro sense, and if we don't agree, then let's talk. But there doesn't seem to be any one thing jumping out on a either total or normalized through per capita spend level that you could point to and say, well, that's the issue. So we should, and we'll do so with education, if we want to bring in some of the bigger town departments and go through in much more detail, what does that look like? We should do that exercise. And to your point, if where this committee goes, where the community wants to go, is looking at the revenue side, is looking at the override, it wouldn't be this fixes everything, everyone gets everything they need. I think it's an incredibly hard choice.
Chris?
Since you opened it up, whoops, didn't mean to throw that at you. I have 3 comments. First of all, I have to say that the report that you wrote you were so positive talking about a negative issue. I was just amazed on how well you did that.
I appreciate that.
Second of all, I see it more as a desire versus revenue, as opposed to money versus money. So desire is what the town wants, what the town has a desire to have. There are things within desire, there's things you have to have, and things you want. And so I think it's a desire versus the money to pay for it. Do you want a good school system, or do you want a bad school system? Do you want a good town with good roads, or do you want a bad town with bad roads? I mean, it's the desire. And as far as the towns that have more commercial, at the end of my career, I did some long-term subbing in Foxborough. And I was at the middle school, and I talked to the principal. I said, boy, you have an awful lot of stuff here. I mean, they had violins and basses that the kids could borrow for the orchestra. And she said, it's all Bob Kraft. And so here we are with the situation again, the commercial versus the the residential. And comment of the master plan. I was on the master plan 10 years ago. I know you're doing a look back, a 10-year look back at it, but a lot of the discussion about what Easton was is in the master plan, I believe. And so I think too that although I am an unemployed historian, I love history, but we also have to look at how the town's going to be as opposed to what it was. You talk to Ed Hands, it's no longer a farming community. That's what it was. There's no farming anymore in Easton. So we can't, I mean, we don't make cannons anymore at the foundry, right? And so it's not what it was, it's what is it going to be? And I think that's, again, what you're going to be looking at when you look at the 10-year results of the master plan. Is the master planning going in the right direction?
Right. I appreciate that. And that's actually something that our budget goes through a vetting process for a national award. And one of the things that they actually ask is, do you tie your budget to a community master plan? Which we do, because it's important. I don't want folks to feel that we're removed. You know, there are some things where, like, I write a report on revenue deficit, but there's a lot of foundational guiding documents for why we do what we do and where we put our values that are based on community-driven processes like the master plan.
We did a lot of work to
You did,
develop that master
and we
plan.
appreciate it. And it's been a great guiding document. You would, as a former planning board member, not to go on and on, but you would appreciate the staff reports now when the planning board is reviewing a proposal, has a section devoted to which of the deliverables and tasks and objectives of the master plan would this project
Really?
advance.
Because the master plan before that, I was probably 20 years before I even went on the board, so.
I think it was in the 70s.
We needed a new master plan.
That's a good point. Thank you.
So sticking with the left side to finish off this side, Marissa?
Yeah, I think just this whole process has really demonstrated the comment that was just made is, who do we want to be? Right? I think that's the whole thing here, is who do we want to be in 10 years? Who do we want to be out of this whole process? What are our core values that we keep talking about, and what Easton wants to be? So if anything, this whole process has just kind of made me think we have to be creative and resourceful, and we're already doing that. And so it just gave me an opportunity to think about, where can we expand what we already have, right? If we have these spaces available, where we can revitalize pre-existing spaces, if we're talking about not being able to tap into wetlands, but there are areas in Easton that we can work with. I know it might be jumping the gun, but this is just these conversations and seeing the expenses and the revenue and everything that's going into it. It's where can we work within what we already have to be creative and to be flexible and to continue to do what we value as a community, right? And if we do enjoy the fact that we do more with less, we can tap into that as a value and try to exercise and show to people that we're willing to make concessions and that we're being as transparent as possible.
Sure.
Great point.
It's you.
I agree with a lot of what you were saying. I think, like, what I'm having a difficult time with is understanding we're a residential town, but that it's difficult sometimes for our builders to build. But do we want to be more of a commercial town, or are we looking to be more of residential? How can we make that work in our favor so that we can make the growth that we would like to see, if growth is what we want to see?
No, that was good. I think those are really big questions. I think depending upon who you ask, I get a chance to talk to a lot of people. And I know that there are some friends of mine who are like, we're good, don't build. Like, we are good, everything is good, keep everything the same. And then there are others that are like, you know, look, it's really hard to get some projects done here. I've had contractors that work outside of our town say, yeah, it can be a challenge there. And so that's not because we don't do a good job. It's not because we aren't instituting things to make permitting easier. It's not because we're not trying, but like, there's just some fundamental aspects to Easton that a lot of people find inimitable and they like. Mm-hmm. So I think it's okay now for today for us to be saying things like, if that's what we may want to value in but we're gonna have to nail that down and kind of balance those things to say, and that's good feedback from everybody, different constituencies. I don't know what right is, but I know we have to start talking about what we think it is, and that's gonna get hard. In a good way, a really good way.
I would say that the per capita data was very insightful. I think we're overall on the same page. We're talking about what types of inputs we want to target as we move forward. One of the things I'm thinking of is, as you guys are talking about, what does the community value? Are there other ways to start thinking about how we're going to actually derive that information from the community outside of this committee?
Mm-hmm. Good point. Love it. Outreach. Dr. Brown.
Well, we have a lot of information to share, and I would love it, especially, I know this is slightly off topic, but we did note that next week we'll be talking about the school department. It would be really helpful to us to know what is information that people are looking for, interested in, that would help them better understand what's happening. We have a lot of similar data points as in here, but we do need to know what is it that people are looking for. So that the way we drive our budget every year is reactive needs, proactive needs, and strategic needs. And for the 12 years I've been here, we've been reactive. We are now trying to maintain that reactive posture. We articulate what we could offer as a school district if we were working in a proactive position or a strategic position. And while it hasn't been a direct conversation with people, just based on votes and funding, it seems as though reactive is the place where people are most comfortable with financially. We are at a point structurally, though, where we are going to have difficulty maintaining reactive. And so it's important for us to understand from the public exactly what they're looking for. We have the results we have because of the people we have. It is on the back of every single employee who does triple duty every day, and we need to be able to keep them. Without them, we don't have the results we have. And so it's just sort of, I don't want to reduce this conversation to an a la carte, but I feel it's very important. We're not shooting for something that maybe the town doesn't have an appetite for, or we're making it clear if this is what you're shooting for, we can't afford any of that. So where do you wish us to direct what we're offering as service to the community?
So homework from everybody. I'm going to ask everybody to reply. Even if you say, I got nothing, I'll at least take your reply. But what do you want to hear from the schools? So you got to send me at least a sentence. You got to give me something. That'll give us a theme. Dr. Brown, I'll reach out to you. Obviously, try to connect with folks to connect dots, Jen, and say, like, can we have this flavor? It seems like there's a lot of ask. I'm highly confident we'll have a lot of numbers and datas and percentages and per people. I've seen those, so that's, I think, will be super helpful. Next, I would gladly hang out with you next Wednesday and talk this if you want, but the meeting is October 9th, so you've got some time.
Our meeting's October 9th?
Yes.
Yes.
Our next meeting's October 9th, so not next week.
PASE.
I got scared too for a second.
Right? Right? I was excited. I thought we were all going to get together again next week, but
3 days a week.
so you got some time? Is that bad? Good? Are you traveling? Big this meeting? Traveling?
It's a personal problem that I will overcome.
Sounds good. Gotcha. Apologies.
A great answer.
But we do have an agenda item to talk about the next meeting, so maybe we can revisit that. So don't put that in stone. But it's not next week. That's the we got that. But does that sound good? Homework. We got to really inform what do we want the school presentation to be, so you can get the maximum amount of benefit. Second homework. I'd like to know which departments from the town side you would like to get additional detail on, so that we can have that representative come in, and you can drill into what does it mean if we don't do this, or where are you?
Yeah, and as specific as you can be is helpful, because I want to make good use of your time and any of those department chiefs if they come in. So if there's particular areas that you want, is there data available on this or that, let Tom know and he'll get it to me and we'll make sure we get that. So I don't know if you were trying to go around the entire room.
I was.
Okay, good. I'll wait for
This is
Patrick.
called the forced participation phase of
Okay.
the meeting.
Okay.
Just to loosen things up. Patrick can't go, he'll take way too long. All right, Patrick.
Thank you. Can I give you one piece of homework right now, which is I wrote down reactionary versus progressive versus regressive, not knowing exactly the vocab you used, but I think that the demonstration that you had done, and I'm not saying that you have to prepare this for October 9th, but the demonstration that you had done in our budget meetings was, for me, being on the finance committee and walking into those meetings going, I wonder where we are. Where are we? What are we looking for? Similar to what James was saying. What are we driving towards? What's the current status of what those impacts are? That to me was the most impactful way to look at something as big as a school budget, right? To look at something and say, personally, my children are in a school system that is by necessity in this stage, and here's the way to get out of it, or here's the way to address it. That was, I thought, an excellent way to categorize it. For me, echoing what a lot of other people have said, like, I think the underlying difficulty we have is that we can come up with the greatest plan possible, but will it pass town meeting?
So I do just want to point out, I did not include it in the email because I write emails that are too long already. We do have on the PASE page, so I will assign more homework, all the presentation materials that we used in the most recent round of budgets.
I didn't pull it up.
And I think, Jim, you said you were on a finance committee before. A lot of those are kind of questions we hear going through that budget development process. So that is linked on your PASE page as well. And it does not necessarily replace having someone come in and present and talk about things. And so I'm not saying that to dissuade you, but it might actually help inform more specific questions. So I would really encourage folks, if you're leaving here today feeling like, okay, well, yeah, maybe there's a problem that's still very nebulous, to go to the PASE meeting material page, and there's links to the budget presentations from every, so you have the budget book, which is dense. These are still pretty long. One night, the slide deck is 140, but it's a bunch of departments. And to Patrick's point, and I think one of yours, Jim, is like, what does that actually translate into? And so the schools use the same metric every year of like, what does it look like if we're funding at this level when that translates into service? What positions will we fund? Here are the things we should be doing. Dr. Cabral usually contextualizes with why should we, whether it's a market competitiveness because these schools are doing this and it leads to this outcome, or it's a coming mandate and we can't afford it. But I think that would be good for folks to take a look at as well, and that's on the PASE page.
Yeah, it hugely eye-opening for me coming into town government in the role that I was in, to be like, what is, to your point, right? What does this actually mean? Like, what is this underfunding or this level funding, or what does that actually impact? And then to go through that budget meeting and to see the impact writ large was very, very eye-opening. My other point, just to wrap it up, is that we've talked about it a lot. I think we're going to continue to talk about it a lot. It's I think you said it well, like, what do we want to be, right? And it's not what do we want to be, it's what do we as a town want to be, and how do we get to that point to address some of these fundamental shortfalls.
So I've said a lot, but I do want to use my allotted forced participation to pull back to what I think is an important point, which is we, in the charge, laid out what we thought was a reasonable timeline. And I'm saying this to be positive, and maybe that's a hard-earned job skill to say negative things positively, but the goal of this committee, there's two things that I think we're doing now and trying to work through. And I don't want folks to feel like we are jumping to like, okay, we've reached a conclusion and you need to go do an override or do this or that. Because what the charge adopted by the school committee and select board identified was identifying a consensus baseline. I think the most high-level version of that was kind of, do we have a problem? Okay, that's good. But identifying a consensus baseline, trend analysis and comparative evaluation, and the first real deliverable when we talk about outreach and engagement is it's this committee's job to come up with a summary of our existing position and outlook. That's not even forward-looking on how do we fix this. And we said let's target December 16th. So I think we still do have time, and should spend it well, not having anyone here feel like we're jumping past any more questions or analysis that we need to do. Because that's just the first part is what is the general consensus we have about what the baseline challenges are? What does that mean as far as an outlook? And how does that inform budgeting? And it really is, and some of this can of course happen at the same time, but I don't want folks to feel like we're just like jumping the gun and just running to a certain outcome. Because as we do more of this, we hear from the schools, we hear follow-ups from folks on things they want to know on the town side. We maybe want to spend more time on policy. We do still have some time. It's not a ton, but we have a few months between now and when the committee is theoretically supposed to say in some kind of written document, this is what we think the existing conditions are and what the outlook is. Mm-hmm. And only then getting to, here are the options for fixing it. And I think that it's going to be really important as part of that to make sure that we're doing, rather than 5-hour workshop meetings where we're reviewing these documents, more kind of summary presentations of, hey, we just spent 5 months doing multiple 5-hour workshop meetings, so we could summarize, this is kind of what's going on, this is the outlook, this is how it challenges us. Here's a really broad, there's only so many options, right? Here's the buckets they fall into. Come talk to us. Let us know what you think. You could do it even as like a kind of planning charrette of, you could do it at a very simple form of like, do you prefer going the revenue route? If you do, is it an override? Is it fees? Do you prefer going the expense route? Okay, if you had to cut, what department? It doesn't mean we're going to say, okay, that's the budget, put it forward. But I don't want folks to feel like we're not going to, I think, be obligated and responsible to do that. And I think that, so I guess that's just my way of saying we have some time still to talk through and hopefully get folks comfortable and close to a consensus on what is a baseline and what's the outlook. So we have time.
Makes sense. Good point.
And I would reiterate Tom's point, if you have additional follow-up questions on any of the town-related stuff, please let he and I know so that we can get you what you feel you need.
Can I just ask one question about meeting expectation scheduling? Which is, if we're, what's today, the 17th? If we're going from the 17th to the 9th, I am not advocating for more. Let me just say that out front. But if we're doing 17th to the 9th, and we have a deadline, I wasn't here last time, so I didn't realize, of December, do we have enough time with monthly meetings, essentially?
No, we actually, so good point. We also probably had that realization last meeting as well, so your timing's perfect. That was how we got to the 9/18 meeting. We gave folks a month to digest everything we had on the site, but now it's a bi-weekly meeting cadence, so it's roughly bi-weekly 10/9, and then the 10/23 is the next date. That was, we sent that off in the email right after, I think it was the last time we met, so August 28th. So we're trying to build that out. I think we do want to talk about the 10/23 meeting, confirm that, and then probably get another meeting on the books. I feel like this meeting and next meeting will once again be building the foundation. Yep. And then probably in the 10/23 meeting, we'll be having some conversations like, all right, what does the future look like? How do we continue to make progress? How do we hit our deadline? How many times do we need to meet? I think we probably want to meet mid-November. I think.
So I have it in my calendar for November 20th. I don't know if I made that up. Nope, I see some heads nodding.
Yep. Yeah, that was the tentative for the 11/20, knowing Thanksgiving was coming.
Which email is this in?
I don't think it, I don't know if it
or was this at the last
I think it might have been at the meeting.
No, I think there was an email.
There is an email that has a couple dates, but it was
August
it goes
28th at 7:49 p.m.
10/23 for tentative. That's why I wanted to know what the future state was. Oh, there's the deadline. Yeah, I should read the email. Just keeping it like usual. Yeah, neither did I. That's why.
It was verbally communicated at the last meeting as the tentative November date. I did not put it in the email because we were still tentative on the 10/23 date. But since nobody has gotten back to me the 10/23 date, it's feeling pretty firm. But we'll see. We have an agenda item to talk next meeting.
I think to Patrick's point, though, I think we kind of have to try and make it work.
Yeah.
And then even after 11/20, we probably need something the first week of December if we're going to have a deliverable in mid-December before the holidays.
Yep. Just to keep this stream of consciousness going on the same line, we do have a meeting discussion bullet point after, but Dottie, did you have any commentary on today's focus points or discussion points?
Yeah, I guess one of the things that I've been thinking about, and the way that I think myself, Connor, the select board thinks about what, also as a layer, you know, obviously values, what do we want to be, but also what is the risk? So for every action that we take, there's going to be a reaction. And it's not just the risk for immediate, but the long-term risk or the bigger picture risk. So we look at 5 years out. You know, if this happens, this is what it might look like in 5 years. And something has always come up to save us, like insurance rates were really low that year, or like these one-time things that happen. So we're kind of flying by the seat of our pants on that. I really feel like we're in emergency mode. Like, I know that we're trying to say that it's not, but from what I've seen happening, there's not one thing that's going to fix it. It's going to be a combination of things on the expense and the revenue side. But I think that we're really not sustainable right now with what we have. So, you know, when I look at, do we give people raises? Well, then where does that come from? If we don't give people raises, then do our people leave? We've been really enjoying a good history of, especially department heads, our, you know, really top level people that have made us be able to do this stuff with less people. You know, they're very much sought after. I worry all the time about Connor being the town administrator. I try to not ever introduce him to people.
I don't know him.
But seriously, I mean, it's kind of a house of cards. We've been doing things and getting things done really well because we have the right people in place and the right staff in place. And I think we need to find a way to protect that. It's our reputation through the schools, through education, through quality services. And I'm really worried about it.
Appreciate that. Good point. Jen?
So continuing on from Dottie's points, I think it's interesting to juxtapose I mean, frankly, like our budget meetings in the spring were like, not in your stomach, you know, and you know, Connor, you had come and we looked at projecting out how, you know, what the use of reserves for the next few years. And even with that, we don't make ends meet. And juxtaposing that against out in the broader community, you know, we hear about if there's talk of a new development or somebody building on this piece of land, and then people get upset, right? And we talked about that. Why can't we have enough? Why can't we keep things the way they are? I like Easton the way it is. And I think it's imperative and a challenge for us to really communicate the economics more broadly, that you cannot continue the services without growth. Literally, the math does not work. 2.5% plus the new growth that we have does not meet the increases that are not going away, right? There's inflationary increases, salary increases, et cetera. So, and I feel like that's a big hurdle and a big challenge for us to be mindful of as we're communicating, that you can't have it both ways, but also to offer people an alternative of what smart growth and smart decision making looks like, because we've probably heard we don't want to name any town around us, right? There's a few that get named, right? If we have this commercial growth go in or these apartment buildings go in, we're going to turn into whatever. And that's not the case, right? There are other communities that are bedroom communities similar to Easton with similar challenges that have been able to succeed or are in the process of, you know, showing success with really smart, thoughtful growth. I think we are one of those towns, right? I think the master plan has brought a lot of revitalization to downtown. A lot of things people would readily say, oh yeah, but I like that. I like this, I like that. So I think part of the challenge is communicating that when we're talking about growth, it's not, you know, maybe some of the negative things that they might be envisioning. It's some of these positive things that we're seeing, so.
Sure, appreciate that. Chris?
I said a lot tonight already.
Perfect.
But I'm looking forward to actually hearing the ideas.
I think that's what will be the unique thing that comes out of this. This group is an obvious need, and it's a matter of outside the box, inside the box, or nothing. But I think it's safe to say that you're gonna get what you pay for at the end of the day. It's a lame expression, but it's so truthful.
Appreciate that.
I agree
Jocelyn?
with that. I think I'm so interested in new growth. I mean, that's been a big topic. A lot of people also have echoed the sentiments on what does Easton value. But as you were speaking, it was interesting, like the town has to vote for an override, but so it's important to, obviously you need to get the buy-in from the town for an override, but you don't need to vote on new growth. I know that might sound insensitive, but just thinking of it that way where, I don't know, it's almost like you wouldn't have, I don't know what word I'm trying to say, but I just want to dig more into what does it look like to have Easton be able to have new growth, what type of new growth makes the most revenue. You know, we're probably not going to have a Gillette Stadium #2 or, you know, another Xfinity Center, but what's the possibility even for Easton?
Sure.
You know, I mean, when you look at the map, what's the space? I mean, I guess what's realistic? I think it's easy for us to say, well, Easton needs more money, so let's have new growth. But what's even possible?
And could I also frame it perhaps in my own mind as you asking largely what's the policy difference? So meaning, to your point, like new growth is largely policy oriented, like we control the zoning, we control what can and can't be built where.
Right.
We as residents vote on that, like we control that.
Okay.
But that's a policy decision, or I'm not sure if, you know, people again want larger plot sizes, if that's quote unquote policy, but you know, we have that is governed separately. Then to your point, changing the 2.5 that's a vote, that's a state law requiring an X number majority to do it.
And then also understanding, you know, an override was mentioned as like a short-term solution. Is new growth then a long-term solution? And does it depend on what that new growth, like the type of new growth, you know, commercial versus more residential, which one's longer?
They're all fun. In theory, it's a great point. I would say in theory, it's probably a time horizon, but land is finite.
Yeah.
So you will eventually run out of, to a degree, new growth unless you have different utilization of existing land in different ways, which might get back a little bit to policy. Maybe it is easier to build more commercial in Easton in the future, and that's what we value. Maybe, and I think we do to a degree with the different sewer districts that have come on. I think we appreciate that conversation, but I agree that that's important, and we can probably speak to that at a future meeting, I would imagine.
Sure.
I think too, it's just the history of Easton and the value of the people here that love it being its residential, beautiful community. I think there is a way to have new growth and still respect that.
Yeah, I agree. I think Chris pointed it out.
Yeah.
Projects have been done. Dottie?
I just want to say, I think you're going to be the next person on the Economic Development Council, by the way. See what happens when people know you're now going to put you on committees.
It's where all of this gets discussed.
you'll
I
know
was
now.
thinking the same thing.
Made a
So
friend.
We've done a lot of plans and studies for strategic areas, like if we put sewer here, it will drive economic development in this area. We did a study in the Queesit sewer commercial district about what kind of businesses, a real comprehensive study for that we should probably share. Also bringing sewer to the industrial park. The industrial park, we've done a number of studies on how that's underutilized because we don't have the sewer in that area. So I think you're spot on. I mean, Stonehill College would be such a moneymaker. What would that look like if we were to put a hotel in that area? There's no hotel for any of those people, or a conference center. These are things that we've been kicking around for years, but they just don't seem to get the traction. But I think you have really great ideas looking at that.
Could I just add, though, and I think an important thing to clarify when we talk about this, we don't do any of that.
We're not building hotels.
Right.
Right.
The town. No, I'm not trying to be
Yeah.
pedestrian here, but there's a lot of folks who are like, well, why doesn't this town have a hotel? Well, because of policy factors, because of infrastructural limitations, and then the question may be, well, why isn't the town sort of industrial park? Well, because up until there was Cleese development, there was no option in town, and we have been working for decades through multiple mayoral administrations to attempt to negotiate a sewer purchase agreement with City of Brockton that we've not been able to do, not for lack of trying. That doesn't mean we can stop trying, but I just want to make sure it's clear too that, and we touched on this earlier with some of what Chris was saying, I think with some of Jim was saying, some of this as well is you do need to build the infrastructure. You need to have, if you want to incentivize growth, perhaps more permissive zoning. But we also we exist in the broader market context, right? And when you could look at sewer as a great example. When the community made the choice not to sewer, the economy was investing in different areas than it is today. By the time, even in the 90s and 2000s, when we were funding these very complex engineering plans on where are the areas that make sense to sewer based on not only environmental impact, but potential economic upside. Think about what the economy looked like in 2002 compared to by the time we built these things. Brick and mortar retail is incredibly hard. Biotech or advanced manufacturing often requires more complex wastewater treatment that we don't necessarily have access to.
And you have the aquifer protection.
We're also in a groundwater protection area. So I just want to make sure that we should have those discussions, but I don't want to sound like I'm bristling, but I always want to make sure it's clear, like, we do not have the ability, and nor am I suggesting you were saying this, I'm more being sensitive to folks who are definitely watching this at 9 o'clock at night at home, to just kind of point at a parcel and say, I want this business here, because you hear that a lot.
Yeah.
A lot. And there's
Why
a lot
can't
of,
we have a blah, blah, blah?
there is a lot of kind of, I think, interesting overlap in people's views of the economy, or maybe perhaps ideological predispositions of, we can, through planning boards, through votes, adopt land use policies, but we don't get to dictate what gets built. We, if we're doing a good job, should incentivize smart growth in areas that could make sense, but at the end of the day, folks have property rights.
When you say we, you mean the town?
Yes. Yeah. Well, but not even the town alone, because a lot of these are impossible without those state grants, right? A lot of these are, today the Fed cut interest by 50 basis points, which probably has a far larger impact on anything happening in the economy than anything we're going to do here, right? So there's all of these different factors that are influencing it. I just always want to be careful. I don't want to tell people don't think big, but I don't want somebody watching this take away that we have the capacity necessarily in the short term to say, well, we should put a New Balance corporate park at the industrial park, because we can't. And
If
so
New Balance is listening, we're open.
But there are other countervailing factors that can kind of knock the progress out from under you too, right? Like finishing the sewers when the pandemic hits.
I guess I do, probably, I feel very just new to this, so I do find it hard to come up with solutions, so I'm excited to get there, because you're saying what department are you interested in digging into more, and I'm sitting here like, I don't know. I don't know what they all do. I'd love to hear from all of them. So, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, Connor, there's everyone wants a Chipotle according to Facebook, so.
But not a Taco Bell.
Yeah, no taco.
So I'll pose a thought experiment. If one gets built, then I'm sure you will equally and as forcefully have an opposite reaction that the Chipotle is unwanted.
I would go for the Easton one over the Mansfield one, if it existed. But no, I hope I don't come off too much as like a negative Nancy expenses, but even with new growth, right, there are expenses accompanying to that. There are, in theory, a higher population, more need for police, fire, strains on water supplies. Like even new growth has hidden, quote unquote, hidden expenses that may not be realized
it's not a flow
immediately.
through.
Yeah, no, it's not
100%
free money. 100%.
like Avalon, that entire project, the impact to the schools was obviously a key consideration of like, we're gonna have a huge number of new housing. What's that gonna do to the overall school budget at the end of the day? That was part of the conversation we had with Blanche James. Like, what are we doing for a future state capacity with the fact that we'll be building more residential?
I would also kind of wonder, new ideas to generate revenue could potentially fall on taxpayers in the shorter term. And I feel like that's the struggle with PACE, is there is a longer term time horizon of what does Easton want to be in 5 years, and also a 1 to 2 years of buying time essentially to kind of get through the budget situation we're in today. But I think it's important, or maybe important for this committee at some point, to talk about the demographics of this region, Massachusetts. There are towns that are losing population. There are towns that are aging. Massachusetts as a whole, population is not necessarily growing at probably the rate that it needs to sustain. And how do you grow population if you are raising people's taxes and making it more unaffordable to live in that state in theory, right? I'm not saying, I don't have the data on Easton. I know the value of our houses is growing, but is that a house of cards that can be sustained for 5, 10, 15, 25 years?
Those are all really good points. We are still growing population-wise at a slower rate than in the 90s and 70s and 80s, which I think conceptually folks don't always. I feel like there's a few things, like when you tell folks we have more residents than Dedham, Mansfield, and Foxborough, people are like, wait, there's no way. And similarly, when you say that the vast majority of population growth in Easton was between the 1950s and 2000, and that it's been single-digit % for 25 years, folks are like, well, that can't be possible. But we are still growing, but that's a really good point. And there are, in the municipal space, out in the western part of the state, I mean, this is existential, where places do have population decline. And it is. It's that really hard, how do you find the right way to balance? Because at a certain point, you tip the scale too far in the other way and exacerbate an existing, well-documented affordability crisis of being in the state. I think the new growth point is great, and I love talking about new growth, and I really appreciate that you pointed out that there's also service costs tied to it. In my professional experience, often I think people are most sensitive to what they perceive service costs to be around residential housing. It's usually far more sensitive around apartments, despite the fact that there are fewer children than single-family homes. But even commercial development, right? And this is not me saying they are therefore bad, but I think some folks say, well, more housing means more services. Just say no. Just do all commercial. Well, depending on the commercial type, you have urgent care facilities. Fire department's there constantly, right? Or an assisted living facility. And so there is no easy one size thing. So it is correct, and I appreciate you bringing it up.
Again, new balance.
One of the things that I think we should explore in the next few meetings is around the communication of our work. I know we have some discussion around having meetings where we might want the public to attend, but so much of what I've learned and heard in these last 2 meetings are things that I hear people in town talking about totally inaccurately. I know we've said this about the schools before. I know people just don't know all of this background. And I know we're all constantly probably responding to people, and they'll say such and such, there's money there. And, you try to explain and they don't want to hear it. And I would hate for all of this work as we present at town meeting. First of all, not everyone goes to town meeting, but even those who are, are sometimes hearing that for the first time, and they don't have the opportunity to process and digest that. So I would just ask that we really start thinking about ways that we can engage the town effectively, in addition to just our personal relationships, but that we can bring some people on board, whether it be that they're bringing excellent ideas that we haven't thought of. I mean, that would be awesome, or just so there aren't these misconceptions that I'm sure we've all heard. So. Yep.
Great point.
Can I ask a more procedural question? Sorry. This might just be for another future meeting for us to think about, but at some point, this group's probably going to have to come to a consensus of what are the ideas we eventually want to present to the town and start communicating, to your point, Nancy, and how are we going to decide? Is it a vote? Do we going to have some sort of motion? I want to include this. Do we all agree? Yes or no? I'm not saying that's a decision that needs to be made today, but it is something that we all, at some point, if we're going to put together some sort of presentation of here's what we recommend, or here's how we want to move forward in the 2025, or the fiscal 2025 town meeting, how are we going to do that and start compiling those decisions?
That's a good question.
I'll look to Tom and Nancy, and probably myself and Dr. Cabral should get together and think about where do those make the most sense. My personal view is that I don't think we can just have meetings like this straight through May and then show up at town meeting.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
It's a question of balancing how much can we get the workshop work done first, and maybe we're making good progress through Halloween. We asked the moderator if she would give us 5 minutes at the special town meeting to say, hey, we exist, one. And as a result of the last town meeting votes, here's the stuff we're working on. And maybe in that December timeframe where the charge says we really want to establish the mutually agreed upon baseline and outlook, try to invite a public information session, not yet focused on here's all the things, all the ideas we have for fixing everything. It's, I think Nancy, one of the most important points tonight is here's what the baseline actually is, because I do think that might be harder than talking about solutions, because this is a good town. And if you're just going about your life, you're busy with your job, with your family.
You don't know?
Why would you?
There's no problem.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right?
Blinders on.
And so maybe, Jim, to that point is making sure there's like a milestone of like the halfway point of even before we start talking what do solutions look like, once we start to coalesce around like what are the baseline problems, what does that mean for, just for today, not how do we fix it, what does that mean for the services that exist today? Here's, if we don't change what we're doing, here's what we think is going to happen. As maybe the first real deliberate attempted like, input session, and then, spend over holidays through the winter and spring talking potential solves.
Agreed. Philosophically, it's harder when you have competing motions of, well, I'm going to go first, I'm going to get my point in, and then I'm going to get a second, and then if you notice today, believe it or not, a big thing happened today. We all agreed we had a problem. And I know that doesn't seem like much, but once you get that, now it's just a matter of what do you think the degree of the problem is. And to Connor's point, we don't have to have the solutions. It's just, and so if we do this right, our conversations, our engagement, and our level of participation will guide us, and you'll start to see probably norms and opinions formalize just via conversations and exchanging ideas, points and counterpoints and sharing. And then at some point, if we do it right, folks like Nancy and I and Connor and Leisha and the chairs, we know how to weave the threads together to say, this is what I think the package is, and how do you want to react to that? Did you like that? Did we not capture that? Well, maybe there isn't a problem. Maybe we get together the next meeting and somebody's like, you know what, I thought about it, there isn't a problem. We should hear that person. Because if there isn't a problem, and I'm not saying there isn't, but you see, that's what this is. And if we do it well these next 2 or 3 meetings, a lot of seeds will be planted about, geez, okay, I'm looking at it this way, I see that, here's what I think the baseline is. So by the time we get to that conversation, a lot of people I think will probably have some pretty well-formed thoughts. And we can probably talk those through. But then ultimately, yes, I would ask for a motion for the final document to say, do we all agree, take a vote for this document that this is what we'll be presenting for the town. And hopefully it's unanimous, but the goal is to get as much feedback, make it as good as possible, and help people realize sometimes this is the best we can get to of all the potential solutions. Is that a fair summary, Dottie? I mean, you guys have been leaders of driving consensus for a lot longer than I am.
I've just found in these instances, it's just like a natural way you just end up in a consensus,
I do think at the halfway point, right, because there's like really 2 key deliverables of this project, which is what is the problem and how does that impact our outlook, and then whatever ways we could solve it and what are we going to recommend to the public. I think once we get closer to that halfway point around holidays, and hopefully are organically coalescing around what are the issues we have, that once that is packaged, that should be voted on, in my opinion. Because in the event this goes south at the end, leading into town meeting, it will be important for the public to understand that along the way, we were formally weighing in on, we agree that these are the problems.
Yeah, I think we said the same thing. Yeah, I'm with
Fair
you.
enough.
It's not every little piece that goes in the document that you vote on. It's once we feel like we have a body of evidence or a report or whatever the deliverable is you want to call it. Next meetings. Thank you all for participating so well in the fourth participation phase.
It was great.
We had sent off next meeting as 10-9, same bat channel, same bat time. Do appreciate everybody being here in person. I think it's incredibly valuable. The follow-on meeting was scheduled for, meetings were tentatively scheduled for 10:23 and 11:20. I think
You said same bad times, 5:30 each time?
5:30.
Okay.
So my question is, after 10-9, I'd like to revisit and just ask, do we feel like that having 10:23 and 11:20 meetings are enough? Because a deliverable is 1 month later. So we would essentially probably be meeting mid-December to review the deliverable that would be due December, is it 21st? 31st?
So, due is a strong word, but the target is December 16th, which I just picked as a Monday before a lot of vacations. Yeah, midway. Yeah.
Sorry, you said October 9th,
The 23rd.
23rd. That was tentative until right now. Okay.
And then November 20th.
Thank you.
So I guess where I'm going with it is, do we need